Before there was America, there was the land, enormous, unimaginable in its scale, a continent stretching from the frozen Arctic in the north to the tropical forests of the south. From the Atlantic coast, where the morning sun first touches the western hemisphere, to the Pacific shore, where the same sun sets over an ocean so vast that ancient navigators considered it infinite. Between those two coasts lies a landscape of staggering diversity, mountain ranges that took millions of years to form, the Appalachians in the east, ancient and worn smooth by time, and the Rockies in the west, younger and sharper, their peaks still jagged against the sky. Between them, the Great Plains, an ocean of grass that once stretched unbroken for 1,000 miles, where the wind moves through the tall grass like waves, rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Columbia, the Colorado, great arteries of water that carved valleys, created floodplains, and provided the highways along which human beings would eventually move and settle and build. Forests so dense that, according to a saying that may or may not be literally true, a squirrel could travel from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River without deserts so dry that the bones of ancient creatures lie exposed on the surface, bleached white by the sun, and everywhere, life. Millions of bison on the plains, salmon so thick in the rivers of the Pacific Northwest that you could reportedly walk across their backs, flocks of passenger pigeons so vast that they darkened the sky for hours as they passed overhead. Ardenf. This was the land that would become America. But it was not empty. Human beings have lived on the North American continent for at least 15,000 years, probably longer. The exact date of the first human arrival is one of the most actively debated questions in American archaeology, and the answer keeps getting pushed further back as the traditional model, still widely accepted in its broad outlines, holds that during the last ice age, when enormous quantities of water were locked up in glaciers and sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, a land bridge connected northeastern Asia to northwestern North America. This bridge, called Beringia, was not a narrow strip of land. It was a broad, habitable landscape, perhaps 1,000 miles wide, covered in people crossed it, not in a single dramatic migration, but gradually, over generations, following the animals they hunted, moving eastward into a world that no human being. Some may have come by boat, following the coastline, moving along the edge of the Pacific, fishing and foraging as they went. This coastal migration theory has gained increasing support in recent years, though direct archaeological evidence is limited because the coastline those people followed is now underwater, submerged by the rising seas that accompany. However they came, they spread. Within a few thousand years of the first arrivals, an astonishingly short time in archaeological terms, human beings had reached the southern tip of South America. They had adapted to every environment the Americas offered: Arctic tundra, temperate forestlands, grasslands, deserts, tropical jungles, mountain highlands, archaeological duhompa. They developed hundreds of distinct cultures, hundreds of languages, hundreds of different ways. By the time European ships appeared on the Atlantic horizon, tens of millions of people, some estimates suggest as many as 100 million across the Americas as a whole, were living on these continents. They had been here for thousands of years. They had their own histories, their own civilizations, their own stories. Tonight, we are going to tell a story that begins with them, but that eventually something that involves ships from across the ocean, and colonies planted on unfamiliar shores, and a revolution that created a new kind of nation, and a civil war that nearly destroyed it, and a rise to global power that transformed the world. The story of America. Before we begin, where are you tonight? What time is it where you are? And what city are you listening from? Leave a comment below. As we travel through centuries of American history together, it's a beautiful thing knowing that people all over the world are sharing this same journey. Now, settle in. This is a long story, and like all the best stories, it begins long before anyone realized a story was being told. The phrase Native American civilization is misleading in its singularity. There was no single Native American civilization. There were hundreds, thousands, if you count distinct communities and bands. The diversity of indigenous cultures across North America was as vast as the continent itself, ranging from complex, hierarchical societies with monumental architecture to small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers whose material culture was deliberately minimal. To treat all of these cultures as a single entity the Indians, as later arrivals would call them, is to make a mistake so fundamental that it distorts everything that follows. So let us take our time along the eastern seaboard of North America, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley. The eastern woodlands cultures developed some of the most complex societies north of Mexico. The Mississippian culture, which flourished between approximately 800 and 1600 AD, built large towns centered around flat-topped earthen mounds that served as platforms for temples, elite residences, and ceremonial structures. The greatest of these sites, Cahokia, located near present Menio St. Louis, Missouri, was, at its peak around 1100 AD, one of the largest cities in the world north of Mexico. Cahokia's central mound, Monk's Mound, covers more than 14 acres at its base and originally stood approximately 30 meters tall. The city may have had a population of 10 to 20,000 people, with additional tens of thousands living in surrounding settlements. It was a major center of trade, religion, and political authority, connected by trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, and then it declined. By the time European explorers reached the Mississippi Valley, Cahokia had been abandoned for over a century. The reasons are still debated: environmental degradation, political instability, drought, social conflict. The silence of the empty mounds was one of the first American mysteries. Further north and east, the Haudenosaunee, the people Europeans would call the Iroquois, had developed one of the most sophisticated political systems in pre-contact North America. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, united 5 nations under a common constitution, the Great Law of Peace, which established principles of representative government, checks on power, and mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution. The Great Law of Peace was not a primitive document. It was a carefully structured political framework that had been developed over centuries and that governed a population spread across a significant portion of what is now New York State and beyond. Some historians have argued, controversially but not without evidence, that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the thinking of the American founders when they designed the United States Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, who had extensive dealings with the Haudenosaunee as a colonial diplomat, explicitly praised their system of government. Whether the influence was direct or indirect, the parallel is real. The idea that free peoples could unite under a common government while maintaining their individual identities was not invented in Philadelphia in 1787. It existed in North America centuries before the first European settlement. The Great Plains, the vast grassland interior of the continent, supported cultures that were, before the arrival of the horse, primarily agricultural in the river valleys and semi-nomadic on the open grasslands. The Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara built substantial earth lodge villages along the Missouri River, farming corn, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters of Native American agriculture, and supplementing their diet with seasonal buffalo hunts. The arrival of the horse, introduced to the Americas by the Spanish in the 16th century and gradually spreading northward through trade and capture, transformed plains life. By the 18th century, nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Crow had developed the horse-centered buffalo hunting culture that would become, in the American imagination, the definitive image of the Native American. This image is powerful. It is also misleading in its suggestion of timelessness. The plains horse culture was not ancient. It was, in historical terms, relatively recent, a creative and extraordinarily successful adaptation to new circumstances that lasted barely 2 centuries before it was destroyed by the westward expansion of the United States. In the arid lands of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan people, sometimes called the Anasazi, though many modern Pueblo peoples consider this term problematic, built extraordinary cliff dwellings and multi-story stone structures in the canyons of present-day Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. The great houses of Chaco Canyon, built between approximately 850 and 1150 AD, were the largest buildings in North America until the 19th century. Pueblo Bonito alone contained over 600 rooms arranged in a massive D-shaped complex that served as a ceremonial center, a residence, and a hub of a trading network that extended hundreds of miles. The engineering was sophisticated. The astronomy was precise. Buildings were aligned with solar and lunar events. The road system connecting Chaco to outlying communities was extensive and carefully constructed. And then, like Cahokia, Chaco was abandoned. Drought, resource depletion, social stress. The reasons are debated, but the result was a dispersal of population into smaller, more sustainable communities that would eventually become the Pueblo, peoples encountered by the Spanish in the 16th century. Along the Pacific coast, from northern California to southeastern Alaska, the cultures of the Pacific Northwest developed a way of life that challenges many assumptions about pre-agricultural societies. The extraordinary abundance of salmon, which returned to the rivers in enormous numbers each year, provided a reliable, renewable food source that supported large, settled populations without the need for farming. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakiutl, Nuchenolth, Coast Salish, and others, built substantial wooden houses, carved monumental totem poles, developed complex social hierarchies, and accumulated wealth that they redistributed through elaborate ceremonies called potlatches. The potlatch was not merely a party. It was a political and economic institution, a mechanism for establishing and maintaining social rank through the conspicuous distribution of wealth. A chief who could give away more demonstrated greater power and commanded greater respect. The art of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the carved and painted wooden objects, the woven textiles, and the formline design tradition, ranks among the most sophisticated and visually striking artistic traditions produced by any culture anywhere in the world. When we talk about the European colonization of North America, we need to be honest about what that process destroyed. It did not simply displace people from land, it dismantled civilizations. It erased languages. Of the hundreds of indigenous languages spoken in North America at the time of contact, many are now extinct, and many more are critically endangered. It disrupted social systems that had developed over millennia. It destroyed knowledge, agricultural knowledge, ecological knowledge, medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, that represented thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. The scale of the demographic catastrophe is difficult to comprehend. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity, swept through the Americas ahead of European settlement, often reaching communities that had never seen a European face. Estimates of the pre-contact indigenous population of North America vary widely, but even conservative figures suggest that European contact resulted in a population decline of 70 to 90%. 70 to 90%. Imagine the world you live in. Imagine 7 or 8 out of every 10 people you know gone, within a generation or two. That is what happened. And it happened not once, not in a single catastrophic event, but repeatedly, over centuries, as wave after wave of disease, displacement, and violence rolled across the continent. The America that the European colonists encountered was not a wilderness, it was a post-apocalyptic landscape, a world that had already been devastated by the diseases that had preceded the settlers themselves. The forests that seemed so vast and untouched, many of them had grown back over land that had been cleared and farmed by indigenous peoples whose populations had collapsed. The apparent emptiness of the continent? It was, in many places, the silence of the dead. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is an essential one, and any honest history of America must begin with it. For most of recorded history, Europe had no idea that the Americas existed. beyond.The was for Europeans a wall, a boundary, the edge of the world, beyond which, according to some medieval traditions, there was nothing but water, monsters, and the void. This began to change in the 15th century. The European age of exploration was not a sudden burst of curiosity. It was driven by a specific combination of factors, economic, technological, religious, and political, that came together in the late medieval period to push Europeans outward. The most important factor was money, specifically the desire for direct access to the luxury goods of Asia, silk, spices, porcelain, gems, that had been flowing into Europe through Middle Eastern intermediaries for centuries. The spice trade alone was enormously profitable. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, these were not merely culinary preferences. In a world without refrigeration, spices were essential for preserving food. They were also used in medicine, in religious ceremonies, and as status symbols. The trade routes that brought these goods to Europe were controlled by Muslim merchants and by the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, that served as intermediaries. Other European kingdoms wanted to cut out the middlemen and establish direct trade with Asia. The question was how. The land routes were long, dangerous, and controlled by powers that had no interest in sharing them. The sea route around Africa, which the Portuguese were slowly exploring, pushing further south along the African coast with each expedition, was promising but agonizingly slow to develop. And then someone proposed a different idea. Go west, Columbus. In 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to finance an expedition westward across the Atlantic. Columbus believed, based on calculations that significantly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, that he could reach Asia by sailing west. He was wrong about the distance, spectacularly wrong. If the Americas had not existed, Columbus and his crew would have died of thirst and starvation long before reaching Asia. But the Americas did exist. On the 12th of October, 1492, Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas. He believed he had reached the outer islands of Asia, the Indies, as Europeans called them. He called the people he encountered Indians, a misnomer that has persisted for over 5 centuries. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas. He explored the Caribbean, touched the coast of Central and South America, and established the first permanent European settlements in the Western Hemisphere. Also initiated a process of colonization that would, over the next 4 centuries, transform the Americas beyond recognition. The impact of Columbus's voyages on the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean was immediate and catastrophic. The Taino people of Hispaniola, the first indigenous races group Columbus encountered, were subjected to forced labor, enslavement, and violence. Within a few decades of Columbus's arrival, the Taino population of Hispaniola had been reduced from perhaps several 100,000 to nearly 0. Columbus himself was a complex figure, brilliant as a navigator, visionary in his pinch, and directly responsible for enormous suffering. He remains one of the most contested figures in American history, celebrated by some as a bold explorer, condemned by others as the initiator of a genocide. Both perspectives contain truth. History rarely offers us the comfort of simplicity. Columbus sailed for Spain, and Spain moved quickly to exploit the discoveries. In the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadors, soldier explorers driven by a combination of religious zeal, personal ambition, and the desire for gold, pushed into the mainland of the Americas. Hernán Cortés, with a force of roughly 600 men, conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico between 1519 and 1521. Francisco Pizarro, with an even smaller force, conquered the Inca Empire in Peru in the 1530s. These conquests, made possible by a combination of military technology, political manipulation, indigenous allies, and above all disease, gave Spain control of vast territories and enormous wealth. The silver mines of Mexico and Peru poured wealth into Spain, making it the richest and most powerful nation in Europe for over a century. The silver also flowed into the global economy, reaching China, India, and the Ottoman Empire through trade networks that circled the globe. Spain established a colonial empire in the Americas that would last for 3 centuries, encompassing most of South America, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, Florida, and the American Southwest. But Spain was not the only European power with ambitions in the New World. France explored and claimed vast territories in North America, the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and the Mississippi River Basin. French colonization was characterized less by large-scale settlement than by trade, particularly the fur trade, which drew French traders deep into the interior of the continent and established relationships with indigenous nations that were, in many cases, more cooperative and less destructive than the patterns established by other European powers. The French did not, as a rule, seek to displace indigenous populations. They sought to trade with them. This distinction mattered. It produced a different kind of colonial relationship, though not one free of exploitation or violence. England came later to the colonization of North America, but when it came with an intensity and a demographic weight that would ultimately transform the continent more thoroughly than any other European power. The English model of colonization was different from the Spanish or French models. The English came to settle. They brought families, they built farms, they intended to stay, and that made all the difference. In May of 1607, 3 English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Doshensteshire, entered the Chesapeake Bay and sailed up a river they named the James, Doshensteshire, after their king. On a marshy peninsula along the riverbank, they established a settlement, Manemazonhimi. It was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and it very nearly didn't survive. The colonists were, for the most part, spectacularly ill prepared for what they faced. Many were gentlemen, men of social rank, who had never performed physical labor, and who had come to Virginia expecting to find gold, or a passage to Asia, or at the very least, a situation that did not require them to dig in the dirt. There was no gold. There was no passage to Asia. There was swampy, mosquito-infested land, brackish water, and a climate that combined sweltering summers with freezing winters. The local indigenous people, the Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated alliance of approximately 30 tribes under the paramount chief Wahan Sanaka, known to the English as Powhatan, watched the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The relationship between the Jamestown colonists and the Powhatan was complex and volatile. There were periods of trade and cooperation. There were periods of violence and mutual hostility. The famous story of Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, who, according to legend, saved the life of the English captain John Smith, is part of this tangled history, though the reality behind the legend is far more complicated and far less romantic than the popular version suggests. Pocahontas was a real person. She was probably about 11 or 12 years old when she first encountered the English. She was later kidnapped by the colonists, converted to Christianity, married an English colonist named John Rolfe, travelled to England, and died there in 1617 at approximately the age of 21. Her story is not a love story. It is a story of cultural collision, political manipulation, and personal tragedy. Like so many stories from this period, it has been simplified and sentimentalized in ways that obscure the difficult truths at its center. The early years at Jamestown were characterized by extraordinary mortality. The colonists died of disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan at rates that threatened to end the colony entirely. The winter of 1609-1610, known as the Starving Time, reduced the population from approximately 500 to about 60. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that some of the survivors resorted to cannibalism. What saved Jamestown was tobacco. John Rolfe, the same man who married Pocahontas, introduced a variety of Caribbean tobacco that grew well in the Virginia soil and found an eager market in England. Tobacco transformed the colony from a struggling outpost into a profitable enterprise. It also created an enormous demand for labor, a demand that would be met, initially, by indentured servants from England, and eventually by enslaved Africans. The first recorded Africans in English North America arrived at Jamestown in 1619, the same year that the colony established the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas. Democracy and slavery. Arriving in the same place, in the same year, the contradiction would define American history for the next 4 centuries. In December of 1620, 13 years after Jamestown, a different kind of English colony was established, far to the north, on the coast of what is now Massachusetts. The Mayflower, a small merchant ship carrying 102 passengers, anchored off the tip of Cape Cod after a voyage of 66 days across the Atlantic. The passengers included a group of religious separatists, people who had broken from the Church of England and who sought a place where they could worship according to their own beliefs without persecution. We call them the Pilgrims. Before going ashore, the men of the Mayflower signed a document, the Mayflower Compact, that established a framework for self-governance. It was brief, pragmatic, and extraordinary in its implications. The signers agreed to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, and to create just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. The Mayflower Compact was not a constitution. It was not a declaration of rights, but it was a remarkable assertion of a principle that would become central to the American political tradition. The idea that legitimate government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. The first winter at Plymouth was devastating. Half the colonists died, of cold, of disease, of malnutrition. The survivors were saved, in part, by the assistance of the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Tisquantum, Squanto in the English sources, who taught them agricultural techniques suited to the local environment. Squanto's story is remarkable and tragic. He had been kidnapped by English sailors years before the Pilgrims arrived, taken to Europe, lived in England and Spain, and eventually returned to his homeland, only to find that his entire village had been wiped out by an epidemic of European disease during his absence. He was the last of his people, and he chose to help the newcomers who had, indirectly, caused his people's destruction. The alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, celebrated, in idealized form, in the American tradition of Thanksgiving, was genuine, if complicated. Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, saw the English as potential allies against rival indigenous groups. The Pilgrims needed the Wampanoags' knowledge and support to survive. It was a relationship of mutual necessity, and like most such relationships, it did not survive the changing circumstances that eventually made it obsolete. Jamestown and Plymouth established the two poles of the English colonial experience in North America. Jamestown was driven by commerce, by the desire for profit, by the exploitation of land and labor, by the cultivation of a cash crop that would feed English markets and enrich colonial investors. Plymouth was driven by religion, by the desire for spiritual freedom, by the creation of a community organized around shared beliefs and shared governance. Both impulses, the commercial and the religious, would shape the development of English North America for the next century and a half. Both would contribute elements to the eventual American identity, and both would carry within them contradictions that would take centuries to resolve, if, indeed, they have been resolved at all. Over the course of the 17th century, England established a string of colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. Each colony had its own character, its own founding story, its own relationship with the law, indigenous peoples of the region, and its own internal tensions. But together, they formed a connected chain of English-speaking settlements that would eventually become the foundation of the United States. The colonies of New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, were shaped primarily by religion. The Puritans, a much larger and more powerful group than the Pilgrims, though they shared similar religious convictions, arrived in Massachusetts in 1630, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the leadership of John Winthrop. Winthrop delivered a sermon aboard the ship Arbella before the colonists even landed. That would become one of the most quoted passages in American history. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he said. "The eyes of all people are upon us." The phrase, borrowed from the Sermon on the Mount, expressed Winthrop's conviction that the Puritan colony would serve as a model for the world, a demonstration of what a truly godly society could achieve, an experiment in righteousness. The reality was more complex. Unto were there, an untu's a theocratic society in which church membership was closely tied to political participation. Religious dissent was not tolerated. Those who challenged Puritan orthodoxy, Roger Williams, who advocated for the separation of church and state, and Anne Hutchinson, who held unauthorized religious discussions in her home, were banished. Roger Williams went on to found Rhode Island, a colony that explicitly guaranteed religious freedom. The New England economy was based on farming, fishing, timber, and trade. The soil was rocky and the growing season short, but the forests were vast, and the offshore waters were rich with cod, a resource that would fuel New England's maritime economy for centuries. Education was valued highly. Harvard College was founded in 1636, only 6 years after the colony's establishment. The Puritans believed that an educated ministry was essential for the maintenance of godly society, and they were willing to invest significant resources in ensuring that their children could read the Bible and their ministers could interpret it. The emphasis on education, literacy, and local self-governance that characterized New England would prove to be among the most enduring legacies of the Puritan experiment. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, the Middle Colonies, America. New York had originally been New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony that was seized by the English in 1664. It retained a significant Dutch population and cultural influence for generations. The Hudson River Valley, with its productive farms and its strategic position as a gateway to the interior, made New York one of the most commercially important colonies. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker, in 1681. Penn's vision was explicitly tolerant. His colony guaranteed religious freedom and established relatively fair dealings with indigenous peoples, at least by the standards of the time. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, grew rapidly into one of the largest and most prosperous cities in colonial North America. The middle colonies were breadbaskets. Their fertile soil and temperate climate made them the most productive agricultural region in English North America. They were also the most ethnically and religiously diverse, home to English, Dutch, German, Swedish, and Scots-Irish settlers, and to Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Jews. This diversity was not always comfortable, but it established a pattern of pluralism that would become one of the defining characteristics of American society. Virginia, Maryland, The Carolinas and Georgia, the southern colonies, were shaped by a different set of forces. Agriculture was the dominant economic activity, but the nature of that agriculture, the cultivation of labor-intensive cash crops, particularly tobacco, rice, and indigo, created a demand for labor that could not be met by the colonial population alone. In the early decades, this demand was met partly by indentured servants, people, mostly English, who agreed to work for a fixed period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land at the end of their service. Indentured servitude was not slavery. It was a temporary condition, with a contractual endpoint. But by the late 17th century, the system was shifting. The supply of indentured servants was declining, and the demand for labor was increasing. The southern colonies turned, increasingly and eventually almost exclusively, to a different source: enslaved Africans. The Atlantic slave trade is one of the defining horrors of human history. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 to 13 million African men, women, and children were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. They were captured, often by African intermediaries who raided neighboring communities, marched to coastal trading posts, packed into the holds of ships under conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty, and sold into bondage on the other side of the ocean. The Middle Passage, the ocean crossing, killed between 1 and 2 million people. Those who survived arrived in a world that regarded them not as human beings, but as property. In the English colonies of North America, the institution of slavery was codified into law over the course of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Virginia's slave codes, which defined enslaved people as chattel, denied them all legal rights, made their status hereditary through the mother's line, and criminalized their resistance, became the model for slavery throughout the southern colonies. By the mid-18th century, enslaved Africans and their descendants constituted a significant portion of the colonial population. In some southern counties, they were a majority. The wealth of the southern colonies, the grand plantations, the elegant architecture, the leisure that allowed a planter class to develop its own distinctive culture, was built on the labor of enslaved people. This is not a sidebar to the American story. It is one of its central narratives, and the enormous consequences of this system, economic, social, political, psychological, would shape every subsequent chapter of American history. What was daily life like in colonial America? The answer depended enormously on who you were, where you lived, and when you lived there. The experience of a Puritan farmer in Massachusetts in 1650 was radically different from that of a rice planter in South Carolina in 1750, which was radically different from that of an enslaved person on a Virginia tobacco plantation, which was radically different from that of a fur trader in the forests of Pennsylvania. But there were common threads. For most white colonists, life centered on the family farm. Agriculture was the primary occupation. The work was hard, physical, and unrelenting, clearing land, plowing fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, maintaining buildings and equipment. The family was the basic economic unit. Husbands, wives, children, and sometimes extended family members all contributed labor. Children were expected to work from a young age. There was no concept of childhood as a period of protected leisure. Boys worked in the fields. Girls helped with domestic tasks, cooking, spinning, weaving, preserving food, making candles and soap. The diet was plain but, in good years, sufficient. Corn, adopted from indigenous agricultural practice, was a staple everywhere. Wheat, rye, and oats were grown where the climate permitted. Pork was the most common meat. Vegetables from kitchen gardens supplemented the diet. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Disease, accident, and the physical demands of agricultural labor took their toll. Women faced the additional risk of childbirth. Maternal mortality was high, and most women bore many children, not all of whom survived infancy. Religion was central to colonial life, not merely as a system of belief, but as the primary mechanism of community organization. The church, whether congregational in New England, Anglican in the South, or Quaker in Pennsylvania, was the gathering place, the center of social life, the institution that marked births, marriages, and deaths, that provided moral guidance and social discipline, that connected individuals to a community larger than their own family. Church attendance was, in many colonies, mandatory. The sermon was the primary form of public discourse. The minister was, in many communities, the most educated and most influential person. The Great Awakening, a wave of religious revivalism that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s transformed the religious landscape. Itinerant preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards drew enormous crowds with emotional, dramatic sermons that emphasized personal religious experience over institutional authority. The Great Awakening had political implications that its participants may not have fully recognized at the time. It challenged established authority. It emphasized individual judgment. It created networks of communication and shared experience that crossed colonial boundaries. It was, in some ways, a rehearsal for revolution. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, daily life in colonial America was defined by labor, violence, and the systematic denial of humanity. The work varied by region and by crop. In the tobacco fields of Virginia, the labor was backbreaking and monotonous, planting, tending, harvesting, and curing tobacco under the constant supervision of overseers. In the rice paddies of South Carolina, the work was conducted in conditions that were even more dangerous, standing in water for hours, exposed to malaria, carrying mosquitoes, laboring in heat and humidity that killed many. Enslaved people were subject to physical punishment at the discretion of their owners. Whipping was routine. More severe punishments, branding, mutilation, confinement, were not uncommon. The legal system offered no protection. An enslaved person had no standing in court, could not testify against a white person, and had no legal recourse against any treatment, however brutal. And yet, within these horrifying constraints, enslaved people created lives. They formed families, though those families could be broken apart at any time by sale. They developed their own religious practices, blending African spiritual traditions with Christianity. They maintained cultural traditions, music, storytelling, foodways, healing practices that connected them to their African heritage and sustained them through their suffering. They also resisted. Not always dramatically, though slave revolts did occur and were feared by the white population far out of proportion to their frequency. More often, resistance took quieter forms: work slowdowns, tool breakage, feigned illness, running away, the preservation of cultural identity in the face of systematic attempts to destroy it. The resilience of enslaved communities, their ability to create meaning, beauty, and human connection under conditions designed to deny all three, is one of the most extraordinary dimensions of American history. By the middle of the 18th century, three great empires faced each other across the forests and rivers of North America: the British, the French, and the many indigenous nations who had called this land home for thousands of years. The collision of these three forces would reshape the continent and, in ways nobody could have predicted, would set in motion the events that led to the creation of the United States. This was not, at first, an American war. It was a war between empires, but its consequences would be profoundly American. The shape of the continent in 1750. To understand the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, you must first understand the geography of power in mid-18th century North America. The British colonies clung to the eastern seaboard, 13 colonies stretching from New Hampshire to Georgia, hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains to the west. Their population was approximately 1.5 million people and growing rapidly, doubling roughly every 25 years. They were prosperous, increasingly self-confident, and hungry for land. To the north and west lay New France, a vast arc of French territory stretching from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi Valley to the Gulf of Mexico. The French population of North America was tiny by comparison, perhaps 60,000 souls, but their geographic reach was enormous. They had established a network of forts, trading posts and settlements that encircled the British colonies. And to the south, Spain controlled Florida and a vast empire in what is now Mexico and the American Southwest. Between these European empires, and, critically, within the territories they claimed, lived hundreds of indigenous nations: the Iroquois Confederacy in what is now upstate New York, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek in the southeast, the Shawnee, Delaware, and Miami in the Ohio Valley, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi around the Great Lakes, the Wabanaki in the northeast, and many others. These were not passive observers of the European struggle for North America. They were active participants, skilled diplomats, powerful military forces, and sophisticated political actors who pursued their own interests in a rapidly changing world. The war that was coming would be, in many ways, their war too. The spark that ignited the conflict came from a place most Europeans had never seen: the Ohio country. the fertile, forested region around the upper Ohio River, roughly encompassing what is now western Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. This was contested ground. The British claimed it based on earlier colonial charters and on a 1744 treaty with the Iroquois, a treaty whose legitimacy the Iroquois themselves might have disputed, and whose meaning the other indigenous inhabitants of the region certainly did. The French claimed it based on exploration and on their network of alliances with indigenous nations. The indigenous peoples who actually lived there had their own claims, ancient, undeniable, rooted in centuries of habitation. Into this volatile situation stepped the Virginia-based Ohio Company, a group of investors, including several of George Washington's older brothers, who had obtained a grant from the British Crown to settle land in the Ohio country. The French saw this as a direct threat. If British settlers moved into the Ohio Valley, they would sever the connection between Canada and Louisiana, cutting New France in half. The French responded by constructing a line of forts through the region to assert their claim. Fort Presqu'Isle, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Marceau, and, at the strategic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where they joined to form the Ohio, Fort Duquesne. The British, alarmed, decided to respond. In 1753, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent a young militia officer into the Ohio country with a message for the French. The officer was 21 years old. His name was George Washington. Washington's mission was straightforward: deliver a letter demanding that the French withdraw from territory claimed by Britain. The French commander received him politely and declined. Washington returned to Virginia with the French refusal and with detailed observations of French positions. His report was published, making the young officer something of a celebrity in the colonies and in Britain. The following year, Washington returned to the Ohio country, this time at the head of a small force of Virginia militia. His orders were to defend a British fort then under construction at the forks of the Ohio. But before Washington arrived, the French had seized the site and built Fort Duquesne. On May 28, 1754, Washington and his men, accompanied by Mingo warriors led by a chief known as Tennecarrison, or the Half-King, encountered a French scouting party near a place called Great Meadows. What happened next remains disputed. Washington's men opened fire. The French commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, was killed. Whether in the initial volley or after surrendering remains unclear. The skirmish lasted perhaps 15 minutes. 10 Frenchmen were killed. It was a small engagement in a remote forest clearing. But it was the first battle of a war that would engulf Europe, North America, and parts of Asia and Africa. The French and Indian War had begun. After the Jumonville skirmish, Washington retreated to Great Meadows and constructed a small stockade. He named it Fort Necessity, a name that reflected his situation more accurately than he might have wished. On July 3, 1754, a French force of approximately 600 men, accompanied by indigenous allies, surrounded the fort. Washington had about 400 men, many of them sick or exhausted. It rained. The trenches filled with water. The gunpowder was damp. Washington surrendered. The terms of surrender, which Washington signed, included an admission that Jumonville had been assassinated, a word that the young officer, whose French was imperfect, may not have fully understood the implications of. The French used this admission for propaganda purposes, portraying the British as murderers. Washington and his men were permitted to march away with their weapons. It was the only time in his life that George Washington would surrender to an enemy. He was 22 years old, and he had just helped start a world war. The British government, recognizing the gravity of the situation in North America, dispatched one of its most experienced generals to take command. Major General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia in February 1755 with 2 regiments of regular British soldiers. He was a professional soldier who had served in the British Army for more than 40 years. Brave, experienced, and utterly convinced of the superiority of European military methods, his plan was to capture Fort Duquesne and drive the French from the Ohio Valley. He assembled a force of approximately 2,000 men, British regulars and colonial militia, and marched westward through the wilderness. Braddock brought with him all the equipment of a European army: heavy cannons, supply wagons, the baggage of a general staff. A road had to be cut through the forest as they advanced. Progress was painfully slow, sometimes only a few miles a day. Washington, who accompanied Braddock as a volunteer aide-de-camp, warned the general about the danger of ambush. Braddock, according to accounts, dismissed these warnings. The general was contemptuous of colonial militia and even more contemptuous of indigenous fighting methods. On July 9, 1755, approximately 10 miles from Fort Duquesne, Braddock's army crossed the Monongahela River. The French and their indigenous allies, a force of perhaps 900 men, mostly indigenous warriors, attacked. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The British soldiers, trained to fight in formation on open European battlefields, found themselves in dense forest, attacked from all sides by enemies they could not see. The indigenous warriors fought from behind trees, from behind rocks, from the undergrowth. The British fired volleys into the forest, hitting nothing. The officers, mounted on horses and clearly visible, were shot down one after another. Braddock himself was mortally wounded, a bullet through his lung. He lingered for 4 days before dying. Of the roughly 1,500 men who crossed the Monongahela that morning, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. Of the French lost 23 killed. Washington, despite his warnings, was in the thick of the fighting. 2 horses were shot from under him. 4 bullets passed through his coat. He emerged unscathed. Years later, an indigenous leader who had fought at the Monongahela would tell Washington that he had ordered his warriors to target him specifically, and that every one of them had missed. The leader concluded that Washington was protected by the Great Spirit, destined for something greater. Perhaps he was right. For the first several years of the war, the French and their indigenous allies dominated. British expeditions against French positions failed repeatedly. The indigenous nations, seeing French victories, aligned themselves accordingly. The war spread. By 1756, Britain and France were formally at war in Europe, the 7 Years' War, of which the French and Indian War was the North American theatre. The fighting extended to the Caribbean, to India, to the coast of Africa, to the Philippines. Winston Churchill, 2 centuries later, would call the 7 Years' War the true First World War. He was not wrong. In North America, the war was brutal, and it was fought in large part along the frontier between British settlement and French allied indigenous territory. Raids, abductions, the burning of farms and villages, the killing of civilians. The war redrew the map of indigenous alliances. The Iroquois Confederacy, after long deliberation, allied with the British. The Cherokee, initially British allies, shifted toward the French after a series of misunderstandings and provocations. Indigenous nations assessed their interests, weighed their options, and chose sides, or attempted to remain neutral, in a conflict not of their making. In 1757, with the war going badly, William Pitt became the effective leader of the British government. Pitt, later known as Pitt the Elder, to distinguish him from his son, who would also become Prime Minister, was one of the most remarkable political figures in British history. Arrogant, theatrical, difficult to work with, but possessed of an extraordinary strategic vision. He recognized that the war would be won or lost in North America, and he was willing to spend whatever it took. Pitt poured British resources into the colonial war. He sent more troops, he sent more ships, he sent more money. He paid colonial governments to raise troops rather than demanding them. He promoted talented young officers. He also changed the strategic calculus. Instead of attacking French Canada through the traditional invasion corridor of the Lake Champlain-Richelieu River route, Pitt planned a simultaneous assault on multiple fronts. The results were decisive. In 1758, the British captured Louisbourg, the great French fortress on Cape Breton Island that guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. In the same year, the British captured Fort Duquesne, the place where Washington had surrendered 4 years earlier, and renamed it Fort Pitt. The city that grew up around it would become Pittsburgh. The French were being driven back. In 1759, the British launched their most audacious operation of the war. An army under Major General James Wolfe sailed up the St. Lawrence River toward Quebec, the heart of French Canada. Quebec was considered impregnable. It sat atop high cliffs overlooking the river. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, was confident that no army could take the city. For weeks, Wolfe besieged Quebec, bombarding the city, attempting to find a way in. Nothing worked. The summer was passing. The British fleet would have to leave before the St. Lawrence froze. Time was running out. Then Wolfe discovered a path. On the night of September 12-13, 1759, British soldiers scaled the cliffs along a narrow, winding trail that led to the Plains of Abraham, an open field just outside the city walls. By morning, approximately 4,500 British soldiers were assembled on the plains. Montcalm, surprised to find an enemy army on the heights above his city, made a fateful decision. Rather than waiting for reinforcements, he attacked. The battle lasted perhaps 15 minutes. The British infantry, formed in a line 2 ranks deep, held their fire as the French advanced. When the French were within 40 yards, the British fired. A volley, then another, the French line broke. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded. Wolfe died on the field, told that the French were running. Montcalm died the following morning. Quebec surrendered. The following year, Montreal fell. New France was finished. The war ended officially with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The terms reshaped the map of North America. France ceded to Britain all of its territories east of the Mississippi River, Canada, and the vast interior of the continent. Spain, which had entered the war late on the French side, ceded Florida to Britain. France compensated Spain by transferring to it the vast territory of Louisiana, everything west of the Mississippi. Britain was now the dominant European power in North America. The continent, or at least the European-claimed portion of it, lay at its feet. It was a stunning victory. Britain had defeated its ancient rival and acquired an empire of breathtaking scope. And it had also acquired a problem that would, within a dozen years, destroy that empire in North America. To understand why the French and Indian War led to the American Revolution, you must understand what the war did to the relationship between Britain and its colonies. During the war, the colonists had fought alongside British regulars. The experience was not always a happy one. British officers regarded colonial soldiers with contempt, undisciplined, poorly trained, unsuited to European warfare. Colonial soldiers regarded British officers as arrogant, inflexible, and ignorant of American conditions. Mutual respect did not flourish. During the war, the colonial governments had been asked, repeatedly, to provide money and troops. Many did so, but they did so as separate colonial governments, each negotiating with the Crown individually. The Albany Congress of 1754, which had attempted to coordinate colonial defense and had proposed a plan of union drafted by Benjamin Franklin, had failed. The colonial assemblies rejected it, and the British government was not interested. The colonies remained separate. They had not learnt to act together. Perhaps most importantly, the war had been enormously expensive. Britain emerged from the conflict with a national debt that had nearly doubled. The British government, looking at this debt, looked also at the American colonies, prosperous, lightly taxed, and, in the British view, the primary beneficiaries of the war that had eliminated the French threat from their borders. The conclusion seemed obvious to London. The colonists should help pay for their own defense. The colonists saw things differently. They had fought in the war. They had died in the war. Their governments had contributed money and supplies, and now Britain was going to tax them, without their consent? The argument would last a dozen years. It would escalate from protest to resistance, from resistance to rebellion, from rebellion to revolution, but that is a story for another section. Before the colonies turned against Britain, there was one more convulsion in the interior of the continent. The French defeat left the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley in an impossible position. They had allied with the French, not out of love for the French monarchy, but because the French presence provided a counterweight to British expansion. With the French gone, there was nothing to stop the British and British settlers from flooding into indigenous lands. In 1763, a coalition of indigenous nations led by an Ottawa leader named Pontiac rose in rebellion. Pontiac was a charismatic and capable leader. He articulated a vision of indigenous unity, a pan-tribal alliance that could resist European expansion. His message resonated. The rebellion was devastating. Indigenous warriors captured 8 British forts. They besieged Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt. Frontier settlements were attacked. Hundreds, possibly thousands of British colonists were killed or captured. The British responded with overwhelming force. And, in one notorious episode, with biological warfare. The British commander at Fort Pitt, Geoffrey Amherst, suggested distributing blankets from the smallpox hospital to the besieging indigenous forces. Whether this was actually done, and whether it caused the smallpox outbreak that followed, is a matter of historical debate. The debate itself is a measure of the brutality of the conflict. Pontiac's war eventually ended, not through military defeat, but through negotiation and exhaustion. But it had demonstrated that the indigenous peoples of the interior were not passive victims of European empire. They were active, powerful, and capable of resistance. The British government drew a lesson from Pontiac's war. The lesson was not that indigenous peoples had legitimate grievances. It was not that British policy had been unjust, or that British settlers had encroached on lands that did not belong to them. The lesson was that colonial expansion into indigenous territory was expensive and destabilizing. Wars with indigenous peoples cost money, and Britain, burdened with the debt from the war it had just won, did not want to spend more money fighting new ones. The solution was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The proclamation drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonial settlement west of that line was forbidden. The lands beyond were reserved for indigenous peoples. To the British government, this was a sensible measure. It would prevent expensive wars. It would allow for orderly, controlled expansion in the future. It was a temporary measure. The line could be adjusted, and was expected to be adjusted as circumstances permitted. To the colonists, it was something else entirely. The colonists had just fought a war, their war as they saw it, against the French and their indigenous allies. They had won. The French were gone. The lands of the Ohio Valley, rich, fertile, inviting, lay open. And now the British government was telling them they could not go there. The proclamation of 1763 was widely ignored by colonial settlers, who continued to move westward in defiance of the law. It was widely resented by colonial elites, who had invested in Western land speculation and saw their investments threatened. It was the first of many British measures that the colonists would experience not as reasonable governance, but as arbitrary restriction. The pattern was being set. The French and Indian War had ended. Britain had won an empire, but in winning that empire, it had planted the seeds of its destruction. The colonies had grown during the war, in population, in economic strength, in military experience, in self-confidence. They had begun, tentatively, to think of themselves not merely as separate British colonies, but as something that shared common interests. And Britain, facing its debts and its new responsibilities, was about to ask the colonists to contribute to the costs of empire, through taxes imposed by a parliament thousands of miles away, in which the colonists had no representation. The colonists would have something to say about that. They were about to say it very loudly. Before we continue toward revolution, let us pause. Let us look more closely at the world that the colonists had built, the world they were about to risk everything to defend or to transform. Because to understand why the American Revolution happened, you must understand what colonial America had become by the middle of the 18th century. Not merely a collection of British dependencies, not quite a nation, but something distinct, something new. A world was being built between the Atlantic and the Appalachians. Let us walk through it. By 1763, the year of the Treaty of Paris, the 13 British colonies had grown into something remarkable. Their combined population was approximately 2 million people, a tenfold increase from 1700. This growth was driven by natural increase. The American colonies had one of the highest birth rates in the world, and by immigration, Germans, Scots-Irish, English, African, though most African arrivals were not immigrants in any meaningful sense. They were captives, brought in chains. Philadelphia was the largest city in British North America, with approximately 25,000 people. New York had about 18,000, Boston about 16,000, Charleston about 12,000. By European standards, London had perhaps 750,000. These were small towns, but they were growing, and they were vibrant. Most colonists still lived in the countryside. Farming was the dominant way of life. But the colonial economy was diversifying. New England had developed a thriving maritime economy, fishing, shipbuilding, and commerce. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, were becoming the breadbasket of the Atlantic world, exporting enormous quantities of wheat and flour. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, were dominated by the plantation system, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. The colonial economy was prosperous. Indeed, by the standards of the 18th century, the American colonists were among the wealthiest people in the world, wealthier, on average, than their counterparts in Britain. This prosperity was not evenly distributed. Slavery in the plantation system concentrated enormous wealth in relatively few hands. But for the majority of free white colonists, the standard of living was higher than what their counterparts in Europe could expect. They had land, they had food, they had opportunity. And they knew it. Colonial society was hierarchical. It was not an equal society. No 18th century society was. But it was less rigidly stratified than European society. At the top stood a colonial elite, wealthy merchants in the port cities, large landowners and planters in the countryside. These men, and they were overwhelmingly men, dominated colonial politics and colonial society. Below them was a broad middle of farmers, artisans, shopkeepers and professionals, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, printers, silversmiths, blacksmiths, tanners, shipwrights, the trades and professions that made colonial society function. Below them were labourers, servants, and the poor. Indentured servants, people who had sold their labour for a period of years in exchange for passage to America, occupied a precarious position. And below everyone, at the very bottom of the social order, systematically excluded from its protections, were enslaved Africans and their descendants. The lines between these categories were not always sharp. A successful artisan might become wealthy, a failed merchant might descend into poverty. Social mobility, the possibility of rising or falling, was a feature of colonial life, more pronounced than in Europe. But for enslaved people, there was no mobility. The system was designed to ensure that there was none. One of the most significant developments in mid-18th century colonial America was the growth of what we might call the public sphere. The public sphere is the space in which people discuss public affairs, exchange ideas, debate policy, form opinions. In 18th century America, this space was created by a network of institutions and practices, newspapers. By 1763, there were more than 24 newspapers being published in the colonies. They were small, 4 pages, weekly, but they were widely read. They carried news from Europe, news from other colonies, and, increasingly, essays and letters debating public issues. Taverns. Every colonial town had them. Every crossroads seemed to have one. They were places where people gathered to drink, to talk, to read newspapers aloud, to argue about politics. They were, in a sense, the coffee houses of the American Revolution. Though, in America, the drink was more often ale or rum. The postal system. Benjamin Franklin, as Deputy Postmaster General of the colonies, established a system that connected the colonies through regular mail delivery. Information moved along post roads, ideas moved with it. Voluntary associations, colonial Americans were joiners. They formed clubs, societies, and organizations for every conceivable purpose. Fire companies, library societies, philosophical associations, Masons. These institutions created networks that crossed colonial boundaries. A merchant in Boston corresponded with a merchant in Philadelphia. A planter in Virginia read the same newspapers as a lawyer in New York. The political crisis in one colony was discussed, analyzed, and debated in all the others. The colonies were beginning to think of themselves as connected, as sharing interests, as, in some still inchoate sense, being one people. The Enlightenment. The great intellectual movement of the 18th century that emphasized reason, science, and human progress, crossed the Atlantic and took root in American soil. Its influence was profound. The Enlightenment was not a single set of doctrines. It was a way of thinking. It held that human beings could understand the world through reason and observation. That knowledge was not merely a matter of received authority, that institutions, governments, churches, legal systems could be examined, criticized, and improved. It was, in its implications, revolutionary. The ideas of the Enlightenment reached the colonies through books, through correspondence, through travelers, and through education. John Locke's 2 treatises of government, published in 1689, argued that government was based on a social contract, that legitimate authority derived from the consent of the governed, and that people had the right to resist tyranny. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, argued for the separation of powers, that liberty required that the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of government be held by different hands. Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Smith. Their works circulated among the educated elite of the colonies. The American Enlightenment had its own distinctive character. It was, in many ways, more practical than its European counterpart. Europeans debated the nature of liberty in salons and academies. Americans were building a society in which those ideas would be tested, and American thinkers made their own contributions. Benjamin Franklin was the most celebrated American of the 18th century. Scientist, inventor, printer, diplomat, philosopher. His experiments with electricity made him famous throughout the Western world. His practical wisdom, published in Poor Richard's Almanac, shaped the moral sensibility of a generation. His vision of a self-improving, self-governing society was profoundly American. The ideas were in place. The institutions were being built. The colonies were becoming something that the founding charters had never envisioned. Whether they could remain within the British Empire was about to be tested. The religious landscape of mid-18th century America was being transformed. The First Great Awakening, the wave of religious revivalism that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, had fundamentally altered the relationship between Americans and religious authority. The Awakening's greatest figures, Jonathan Edwards with his terrifyingly logical sermons about sin and salvation, George Whitefield with his theatrical preaching style and his capacity to move enormous crowds to tears, had challenged the established religious order. They preached that salvation was a matter of personal experience, not institutional mediation, that individuals could, must, come to God on their own terms, that authoritative religious institutions, the Church of England, the established congregational churches of New England, had no monopoly on truth. This was religious individualism, and its political implications were significant. If individuals could judge religious truth for themselves, why could they not judge political truth for themselves? If established religious authority could be challenged in the name of individual conscience, why could not established political authority be challenged in the name of individual rights? The connections were not always conscious, but they were real. The Awakening also had a democratizing effect. Itinerant preachers attracted enormous audiences that crossed class lines. The Awakening created new institutions, new churches, new colleges that competed with established ones. It diversified the religious landscape. By 1763, American religion was increasingly pluralistic, increasingly voluntaristic, increasingly characterized by individual choice rather than inherited obligation. Americans were learning to make up their own minds about God, about government, about everything. At the center of colonial life was the family. The family was not merely a private sphere of emotional attachment, though, of course, people loved, married, mourned, and found meaning in their families as people always have. The family was an economic unit, a system of authority, a legal institution. The family was patriarchal. The father, the male head of household, held legal authority over his wife, his children, and any servants or enslaved people who lived under his roof. He controlled the family's property. He represented the family in public life. Women's roles were defined by domesticity, though the realities of colonial life often demanded that women perform work that blurred these boundaries. Women managed households. They bore and raised children. They produced goods for household consumption and sometimes for sale. They worked alongside men in the fields when necessity required. Marriage was, for most people, a practical arrangement as much as a romantic one. Love was not absent. Colonial diaries and letters are full of evidence of deep affection between husbands and wives. But marriage was also an economic partnership, a social alliance, a means of survival. Children were expected to work from a young age. There was no protected period of childhood leisure. Boys learnt their father's trades or were apprenticed to learn others. Girls learnt domestic skills from their mothers. Education varied enormously. In New England, town schools provided basic literacy to many children. In the southern colonies, education was largely a private matter. The children of the wealthy had tutors. The children of the poor had what their parents could teach them. Enslaved children were systematically denied education. Indeed, in many colonies, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read. The family was the foundation of colonial society, and that foundation was about to be shaken by forces that no family could control. What did it mean by 1763 to be an American? The colonists would not have used that term. They were British subjects. They thought of themselves as English, or as Virginians, or as Pennsylvanians, or as residents of their particular towns and counties. And yet, the colonists had begun to develop a distinctive identity, not yet a national identity, but a set of shared assumptions and experiences that set them apart from their counterparts in Britain. They were more egalitarian in manners, if not always in substance. The elaborate hierarchies of British society, the aristocrats, the gentry, the deference due to rank had been transplanted to America, but they had not taken root in quite the same way. A colonial farmer might be poor, but he was not servile. A colonial artisan might defer to wealth, but he did not bow to lords. They were more independent. The availability of land, stolen in fairness from indigenous peoples, meant that many colonists could support themselves in ways that European peasants could not. Economic independence fostered political independence. They were more literate. Literacy rates in the American colonies were among the highest in the world, particularly in New England, where the Puritan emphasis on Bible reading had created a culture in which nearly everyone could read. They were more diverse. The colonies were a mix of peoples: English, Scots-Irish, German, Dutch, Swedish, African. Religious diversity was extraordinary. Congregationalists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Quakers, Baptists, Catholics, Jews, and many smaller groups lived alongside one another, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. They were more self-governing. The colonial assemblies elected, representative bodies had acquired significant power over local affairs. They controlled taxation, they controlled spending. They had learnt to govern themselves within the framework of British imperial authority. They were, in short, becoming something that the British Empire had not planned for. The stage was set, the actors were in place, the ideas were in the air, and the crisis that would transform these separate colonies into a single nation was about to begin. Ideas have consequences. This is a truth that the 18th century understood with particular clarity. The American Revolution was, in significant part, a revolution of ideas before it was a revolution of arms. The men who would lead it, and the people who would support it, had been shaped by a set of beliefs about government, about liberty, about the nature of human beings and their rights that had been developing for more than a century. Let us trace those ideas. Let us understand the intellectual inheritance of the American Revolution, because the Declaration of Independence did not come from nowhere. It came from books, from debates, from centuries of argument about the most fundamental questions of human existence. What is liberty? What is government? What is the relationship between the individual and the state? The American revolutionaries were, by the standards of their time, remarkably well educated. They had read the classics of Greece and Rome. They had studied the history of republics and empires. They had absorbed the lessons, or what they believed to be the lessons, of antiquity. From the ancient world, they drew a set of convictions that republics, governments in which power is held by the people and their representatives, were fragile, that they were always threatened, from without by foreign enemies and from within by corruption, that they required virtue to survive, by which they meant not merely personal morality, but a willingness to place the public good above private interest. They had read their Plutarch, their Livy, their Tacitus. They had studied the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, how it had been corrupted, how liberty had been lost, how tyranny had replaced freedom. This ancient inheritance gave the American revolutionaries a framework for understanding their own situation. When they saw the British government imposing taxes without consent, quartering soldiers among the civilian population, interfering with colonial self-government, they did not see merely a set of policy disputes. They saw the pattern that had destroyed every republic in history. They were determined that this republic would not share that fate. The American revolutionaries were also, fundamentally English in their political thinking. They drew on a tradition of English liberty that stretched back to the Magna Carta of 1215, the great charter in which King John had been forced to acknowledge that even the monarch was subject to the law. They drew on the struggles of the 17th century, the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the glorious Revolution of 1688, in which the powers of the Crown had been limited and the powers of Parliament had been established. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 was a foundational document for the American revolutionaries. It declared that the Crown could not suspend laws, could not levy taxes, could not maintain a standing army in peacetime without the consent of Parliament. It guaranteed the right to petition, the right to bear arms, the right to trial by jury. These were English rights. The American colonists believed they were entitled to them. The great irony, the tragic, unavoidable irony, was that it was precisely because the colonists had absorbed English ideas about liberty so thoroughly that they could not accept the position that the British Empire eventually required them to occupy. They were being told, in effect, that the rights of Englishmen did not fully apply to them, that Parliament could legislate for them without their consent, that they were subjects of an empire rather than citizens of a commonwealth. This they could not accept, not because they had rejected their English inheritance, but because they had embraced it too completely. If there was one philosopher who shaped the thinking of the American revolutionaries more than any other, it was John Locke. Locke's in terms two treatises of government, published in 1689, set forth a vision of government that would become the foundation of American political thought. Government, Locke argued, was not natural. It was artificial, created by human beings for human purposes. The state of nature, in which human beings lived before the creation of government, was a state of freedom and equality, but it was also a state of uncertainty, because, in the state of nature, Each person was their own judge and their own enforcer of the law of nature. To escape this uncertainty, human beings formed governments. They entered into a social contract. They consented to be governed, but only on certain terms. Government, in Locke's view, was a trust. The people entrusted government with power in exchange for the protection of their rights, particularly their rights to life, liberty, and property. If government violated that trust, if it failed to protect those rights, or, worse, if it actively violated them, the people retained the right to dissolve that government and establish a new one. This was the right of revolution, and it was precisely this right that the American revolutionaries would invoke. Thomas Jefferson, drafting the Declaration of Independence, would echo Locke almost verbatim. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was Jefferson's formulation, but the structure of the argument was pure Locke. Government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. These were not idle words. They were a call to arms from the thinkers of the English Commonwealth tradition. Writers like James Harrington, Algernon Sidney, and the authors of Cato's Letters. The American revolutionaries drew a set of ideas about republican government. A republic, in this tradition, was not merely a government without a monarch. It was a particular kind of political order, one in which power was broadly distributed among the people, in which representation was genuine, in which the rule of law replaced the rule of men. The republican tradition emphasized the danger of corruption, not merely financial corruption, but the more fundamental corruption of placing private interest above the public good. It emphasized the necessity of virtue, by which it meant the willingness of citizens to participate in public life, to serve in public office, to sacrifice private advantage for the common welfare. It emphasized the importance of institutions, constitutional structures that would channel power, check ambition, and prevent the concentration of authority in any single set of hands. The American revolutionaries did not believe that republics were natural or easy. They believed that republics were difficult, that they required constant vigilance, constant effort, constant renewal. They also believed that republics were worth the effort. Beyond Locke and the English tradition, the American revolutionaries were influenced by the more radical currents of the European Enlightenment. Tom Paine, the English-born writer who arrived in America in 1774, would become the most effective propagandist of the revolution. His pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776, transformed the nature of the debate. Paine did not write for the educated elite. He wrote for ordinary people, in ordinary language. He denounced monarchy, not this particular monarchy, but the institution of monarchy itself, as absurd and unjust. He called for independence not as a calculated political move, but as a moral imperative. Common Sense sold perhaps 150,000 copies in its first year in a country of roughly 2.5 million people. Proportionally, it may be the best-selling book in American history. Paine's vision was radical in its implications. He imagined a society in which ordinary people, farmers, artisans, laborers, could govern themselves. He imagined a break not merely with British rule, but with the entire system of hereditary privilege and aristocratic domination that characterized the old world. It was a vision that many of the more conservative revolutionary leaders, men like John Adams, who believed in balanced government and feared the mob, found deeply unsettling. But it was a vision that resonated. It resonated widely, because Paine was articulating something that many ordinary Americans already believed. The American revolutionaries took these various intellectual traditions, the classical, the English, the Lockean, the Republican, the radical, and forged them into something new. The American synthesis was distinctive. It combined a deep respect for individual rights with a commitment to republican self-government. It recognized that liberty required both freedom from arbitrary power and the opportunity to participate in the exercise of power. It held that government was legitimate only when it rested on the consent of the governed. But that consent, once given, created genuine obligations. It believed in the rule of law, that government must operate according to established rules, not the arbitrary will of rulers, and it held that these principles were not merely the inheritance of any particular people or nation. They were universal. They applied to all human beings, everywhere. This universality was perhaps the most radical element of the American creed. The Declaration of Independence did not speak of the rights of Englishmen. It spoke of the rights of man. This was an aspiration that the United States would fail to live up to, spectacularly, repeatedly, in ways that caused immense suffering. But the aspiration itself was transformative. It set a standard against which the nation would be measured, by its own people, by the world, by history. How did these ideas reach the people who would act on them? Through newspapers. In the decades leading up to the revolution, colonial newspapers proliferated. They reprinted essays from European sources. They published letters from colonial readers debating political questions. They carried the speeches of political leaders through pamphlets. The pamphlet was the characteristic literary form of the revolution. Short, cheap, easily produced and easily distributed, pamphlets allowed for the rapid dissemination of arguments and ideas. Through sermons, the colonial clergy played a crucial role in the political education of their congregations. Ministers preached about liberty, about tyranny, about the obligations of rulers and the rights of the ruled. Through conversation, in taverns, in homes, in marketplaces, at militia musters, Americans talked about politics with an intensity that astonished foreign observers. They were, as one visitor noted, a people who seemed to be constantly debating the nature of government through correspondence. The colonial elite maintained extensive networks of correspondence. Letters traveled up and down the coast, carrying news, exchanging opinions, coordinating action. The result was a population that was, by the standards of the 18th century, remarkably well informed about political questions. They had been prepared, by decades of reading, debating and arguing, for the crisis that was about to descend upon them. They did not know exactly what was coming, but they had been thinking about the questions that the coming crisis would force them to answer. Ideas have consequences, the ideas that had been developing for more than a century, in the academies of Europe, in the meeting houses of America, in the pages of books and newspapers and pamphlets, were about to be tested. Tested not in theory, but in practice. Tested not by philosophers, but by ordinary people asked to make extraordinary choices. The test would be brutal. It would cost lives. It would demand sacrifices that those who made them could scarcely have imagined, but the ideas would survive the test. They would emerge from it transformed, clarified, hardened, given the weight of experience, and they would become the foundation of a new nation. A nation conceived in liberty, as Lincoln would later say. A nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The crisis came in stages. It began, as so many revolutions do, with money. The British government, facing a national debt that had nearly doubled as a result of the 7 Years' War, decided that the American colonies should contribute to the costs of their own defense and administration. The colonists disagreed. What followed was a 12-year argument, an argument that escalated through laws and protests and violence, through reason and rage, until there was no going back. Let us walk through those 12 years. Let us trace the path from loyal protest to open rebellion. Because the American Revolution was not a single event, it was a process in which each step narrowed the possibilities of peaceful resolution, in which each escalation made reconciliation harder to imagine, in which both sides, British and American, made choices that led, with a kind of terrible logic, toward war. The first major British attempt to raise revenue from the colonies was the Sugar Act of 1764. The act was actually a reduction of an earlier tax, the Molasses Act of 1733, which had imposed a prohibitive duty on molasses imported from non-British sources. That tax had been widely evaded. The Sugar Act reduced the rate, but provided for more effective enforcement. To the British government, this was reasonable. A lower tax that would actually be collected. To the colonists, it was alarming, not because of the economic burden, but because of the principle. The Sugar Act was designed to raise revenue, not merely to regulate trade. It was, in the eyes of the colonists, a tax, and a tax imposed without their consent. The phrase that would define the coming decade had not yet been coined, but the idea was already there. No taxation without representation. If the Sugar Act was a tremor, the Stamp Act was an earthquake. Passed by Parliament in March 1765, the Stamp Act imposed a tax on virtually every kind of printed document in the colonies. Newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, playing cards, almanacs, all of them would now require a stamp, purchased from the British government, to be valid. The Stamp Act was different from previous revenue measures. It was a direct, internal tax, a tax on activities within the colonies, rather than a customs duty on trade, and it applied to everyone. Merchants, lawyers, printers, ordinary people buying a newspaper or playing a game of cards. The colonial reaction was explosive. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses, led by a young fiery lawyer named Patrick Henry, passed resolutions declaring that only the colonial assemblies could tax the colonies. Henry's speech in support of these resolutions was so inflammatory that some listeners accused him of treason. His reported response, "If this be treason, make the most of it," became legend. In Massachusetts, the call went out for a Congress of delegates from all the colonies. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York in October 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates. They issued a declaration of rights and grievances, respectful in tone, but firm in substance. They acknowledged their allegiance to the Crown, but denied that Parliament had the right to tax them without their consent. And throughout the colonies, popular resistance erupted. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized protests. Stamp distributors were intimidated into resigning. In some cases, their homes were attacked, their effigies burned. Mobs marched in the streets. Committees of correspondence coordinated resistance across colonial boundaries. The Stamp Act had united the colonies in opposition as nothing before had done. The British government was stunned by the colonial reaction. British merchants, feeling the effects of colonial boycotts of British goods, added their voices to the demand for repeal. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but on the same day it passed the Declaratory Act, a law asserting that Parliament had the full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. Parliament was repealing the Stamp Act, not because it lacked the authority to impose it, but because the act was, in Britain's view, inexpedient. The colonists celebrated the repeal as a victory. But the fundamental question, did Parliament have the right to tax the colonies without their consent, remained unanswered. Or rather, it had been answered, by the colonists who said no, and by Parliament which said yes. The positions were irreconcilable. If the British government thought that repealing the Stamp Act would end colonial resistance, it was soon disabused. In 1767, Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a brilliant but erratic politician, proposed a new set of taxes on the colonies. The Townshend Acts imposed duties on imported goods, glass, lead, paint, paper, and, most famously, tea. Townshend believed that the colonists would accept these taxes because they were external, duties on trade, rather than internal taxes like the Stamp Act. He was wrong. The colonists made no such distinction. Whether the tax was internal or external was irrelevant. The principle was the same. Parliament was taxing people who had not consented to be taxed. The colonial response was swift. The Massachusetts Circular Letter, drafted by Samuel Adams and James Otis, called on the other colonies to resist the Townshend Acts. Non-importation agreements, boycotts of British goods, were organized across the colonies. The British government, alarmed by the growing resistance, dispatched troops to Boston to enforce order. The presence of British soldiers in a colonial city, soldiers who were in effect an army of occupation, was itself a source of grievance. The soldiers were quartered among the civilian population. They competed with local labourers for jobs. They were a visible, daily reminder of British authority. The situation in Boston was becoming explosive. On the evening of March 5, 1770, it exploded. A crowd gathered outside the Custom House in Boston, where a British sentry was on duty. The crowd was angry, words were exchanged, snowballs were thrown. The sentry called for help. A squad of British soldiers arrived. The crowd grew, more snowballs, more insults. A soldier was knocked down. Then, chaos. The soldiers fired into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and indigenous descent, was the first to fall, the first casualty of what would become the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as it was immediately called, could have been the spark that ignited a war, but cooler heads prevailed. For the moment, the British soldiers were tried for murder. Their defense attorney was John Adams, a prominent lawyer and patriot who believed fiercely in the right to a fair trial, even for soldiers who had killed his fellow colonists. Adams won acquittal for the captain and most of the soldiers. 2 were convicted of manslaughter. The trial diffused the immediate crisis, but the underlying tensions remained, and they were about to be inflamed again. For several years, the situation remained relatively quiet. The Townshend Acts were partially repealed, all the duties except the one on tea. The colonists maintained their boycott of British tea. Smuggling provided an alternative supply. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. The Tea Act was not in itself a new tax. It was an attempt to rescue the British East India Company, which was in severe financial difficulty, by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing British middlemen, at prices that would be lower than even smuggled tea. It seemed like a clever solution. The colonists would get cheaper tea. The East India Company would be saved. The principle of parliamentary taxation would be maintained, because the tea tax, the last remnant of the Townshend duties, would remain in place. The colonists saw it differently. They understood the Tea Act as a trap. If they accepted the cheaper tea, they would be accepting the principle that Parliament could tax them. The lower price was, in their view, a bribe. In port cities across the colonies, the East India Company's tea shipments were refused entry or left to rot on the docks. In Boston, on December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, some of them disguised, poorly, as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbour. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was an act of deliberate theatrical destruction. It was not a mob action. It was conducted with precision. The tea was destroyed. Nothing else was damaged. It was a statement. The message was unmistakable. The colonists would not be bought. The British government's response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and severe. Parliament passed a series of laws that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The British called them the Coercive Acts. The name tells you much about the gulf of perception between the two sides. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, effectively strangling the economy of the city. The Massachusetts Government Act drastically altered the colony's charter, giving the royal governor vastly expanded powers and severely restricting town meetings, the traditional form of local self-government in New England. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain, effectively placing them beyond the reach of colonial justice. The Quartering Act required colonists to provide housing and supplies for British soldiers, and, to add to the sense of outrage, the Quebec Act, passed in the same session of Parliament, extended the boundaries of the province of Quebec to include much of the Ohio Valley, territory that several colonies had claimed. The Quebec Act also recognized the Catholic Church in Quebec, alarming the predominantly Protestant colonists, who saw in it the spectre of popery imposed by a distant parliament. The message from London seemed clear. The colonies were to be brought to heel. But the effect was the opposite of what the British government intended. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the coercive acts united the colonies behind it. If Parliament could do this to Boston, the reasoning went, it could do it to any city, any colony. The time for protest alone was passing. The time for collective action had arrived. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. Georgia, the youngest and most vulnerable colony, stayed away. The First Continental Congress was not a revolutionary body. Most of the delegates were not seeking independence. They were seeking redress of grievances. They wanted to restore the relationship between the colonies and Britain to what they believed it had been before the crisis began. But they were also preparing for the possibility that their grievances would not be redressed. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting the rights of the colonies and calling for the repeal of the coercive acts. It established the Continental Association, an agreement to boycott British goods until their grievances were addressed. Committees of observation and inspection were to be established in every community to enforce the boycott, and it agreed to meet again, in May 1775, if their grievances had not been satisfactorily addressed by then. The First Continental Congress did not declare independence, but it did something almost as significant. It created a mechanism for the colonies to act together. It was the beginning of a national government, tentative, provisional, but real. The colonies were no longer 13 separate entities confronting the British Empire alone. They were beginning to act as one. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was effectively in rebellion. The royal governor, General Thomas Gage, had been driven from Boston. Colonial militias had been drilling and stockpiling weapons. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched approximately 700 British soldiers to seize colonial military supplies stored at Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. The colonists were warned. Paul Revere and William Dawes, and a young doctor named Samuel Prescott, whose name is less famous but who was the only one of the 3 to complete the journey, rode through the night, alerting the militia. On the morning of April 19, the British soldiers reached Lexington, a village on the road to Concord. A small group of colonial militia, approximately 77 men, had assembled on the village green. British officers ordered the militia to disperse. The militia began to do so, but someone, no one knows who, fired. When the firing stopped, 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more were wounded. The British marched on to Concord, where they met a much larger colonial force. Fighting broke out at the North Bridge. The British were forced to retreat. And then, on the long road back to Boston, the killing truly began. Colonial militia, thousands of them, lined the road. They fired from behind trees, from behind stone walls, from the cover of buildings. The British retreat became a rout. By the time the surviving soldiers reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered more than 270 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The colonial losses were less than 100. The American Revolution had begun. It had taken 12 years. 12 years from the Sugar Act to Lexington Green. 12 years of argument and protest and escalation. 12 years in which both sides made choices that made other choices impossible. Looking back, it can seem inevitable, as though the forces of history were pushing inexorably toward war. It was not inevitable. At many points along the way, different choices might have been made. The British government might have recognized the legitimacy of colonial self-government. The colonists might have accepted a subordinate position within the empire. But they did not. Neither side did. The British government was trapped by its own conception of sovereignty, the belief that Parliament must be supreme in all matters, that there could be no compromise on the principle of authority. The colonists were trapped by their own conception of liberty, the belief that taxation without consent was not merely burdensome but tyrannical, that the rights they claimed were not privileges to be granted, but inheritances to be defended. These two conceptions could not be reconciled. They could only be resolved by force. And so, on a spring morning in a small Massachusetts village, the shooting began. It would not stop for 8 years. After Lexington and Concord, the colonial militias did not disperse. They remained in the field, surrounding Boston, keeping the British army trapped in the city. But a militia is not an army. A militia, composed of citizens who leave their farms and workshops for short periods, who elect their own officers, who serve under their own terms, can fight a battle. It cannot win a war. Winning a war requires an army, a standing force. Soldiers who are trained and disciplined and equipped and supplied. Soldiers who will stay in the field for months, for years, through defeats and privations and the despair of endless campaigning. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in May 1775, understood this. And so, on June 14, 1775, it authorized the creation of the Continental Army. The next day, June 15, it appointed a commander. The choice was not obvious. There were other candidates. Men with more military experience, men who had served in the British Army, men whose credentials and connections might have seemed more suitable. But the Congress chose George Washington. The choice, as it turned out, was inspired. George Washington was 43 years old in 1775. He was a wealthy Virginia planter, the owner of Mount Vernon, a man of substantial property, including, it must be noted, enslaved human beings. He had military experience, but it was limited. His service in the French and Indian War had been brave, but not always successful. He had surrendered at Fort Necessity. He had accompanied Braddock on his disastrous expedition. He had commanded Virginia's provincial forces with competence, but not with brilliance. What he had not done was command a large army in a major war, and yet the Congress chose him. Why? Partly it was political. Washington was from Virginia, the largest and most populous colony. Choosing a Virginian to command the army helped bind the South to the war effort, which was, at that point, centered in New England. Partly, it was personal. Washington looked like a commander. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, with a commanding presence. He carried himself with dignity. He projected strength, confidence, resolve. But there was something more. Washington understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the revolutionary leadership, that the army was not merely a military instrument. It was a political institution. It was the visible embodiment of the revolution. It had to be more than effective. It had to be legitimate. Washington insisted from the beginning that the army be subordinate to civilian authority. He reported to the Continental Congress. He respected its decisions, even when he disagreed with them. He rejected, repeatedly, suggestions that the army should assert political power. In an age when military commanders routinely became dictators, and would continue to do so, as Napoleon would soon demonstrate. Washington's commitment to civilian control of the military was extraordinary. It was, in many ways, his greatest contribution to the American experiment. The army that Washington took command of in July 1775 was, to put it charitably, a work in progress. The men were brave. They believed in their cause, but they were not soldiers. They were farmers and artisans and laborers who had left their homes to fight. They had no uniforms. They wore the clothes they had brought from home. They had little training. Many had never fired their weapons in combat. Their officers were elected, a democratic practice that made for popularity, but not necessarily for competence. They were also, in the tradition of colonial militias, not inclined to take orders that they did not agree with. They argued with their officers. They came and went as they pleased. They were fighting for liberty, and they believed that liberty applied to them as much as to anyone else. Washington, who had served alongside colonial militia during the French and Indian War, and had formed a low opinion of them, faced a daunting task. He had to turn this collection of citizen soldiers into an army, while somehow preserving the revolutionary spirit that had brought them into the field in the first place. The transformation would take years, and it would never be fully completed, but it would be completed enough. Washington's first challenge was to maintain the siege of Boston. The British Army, under General Gage, was trapped in the city. The Royal Navy controlled the harbour, allowing supplies to come in and out. But on land, the British were surrounded by colonial forces dug in on the heights around the city. It was a stalemate. The British could not break out. The colonists could not force the British out. Washington chafed at the inaction. He wanted to attack. His officers, many of whom had seen the British Army in action and had a healthy respect for its capabilities, counselled patience. Then, in the winter of 1776, an opportunity presented itself. A young bookseller from Boston named Henry Knox, who had taught himself artillery from books, and who would become one of the Revolution's most important military figures, proposed an audacious plan. Fort Ticonderoga, in upstate New York, had been captured by colonial forces early in the war. It contained a substantial supply of artillery cannons, mortars, howitzers. Knox proposed to transport these heavy guns overland through 300 miles of winter terrain to Boston. Washington approved. What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the war. Knox and his men dragged nearly 60 tons of artillery through snow and ice, across frozen rivers, over mountains. The journey took more than 2 months. It should have been impossible. It was not. In March 1776, Washington placed these guns on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. The British, realizing that their position had become untenable, evacuated the city. The first year of Washington's command had ended in victory. The victory at Boston was followed by disaster. The British returned in force. In the summer of 1776, General Howe, reinforced by a massive fleet under his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, landed on Staten Island with an army of approximately 32,000 men. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent across an ocean. Washington had moved his army from Boston to New York, correctly anticipating that the British would attack there. But his position was, in retrospect, nearly impossible. The British had command of the sea. They could land troops wherever they chose. They had more men, better trained, better equipped. The Battle of Long Island, fought on August 27, 1776, was a catastrophe for the American cause. The British outmaneuvered Washington's forces and inflicted heavy casualties. The Continental Army was nearly trapped and destroyed. Washington managed to evacuate his army across the East River to Manhattan, a remarkable retreat conducted under cover of night and fog, which saved the army from annihilation. But the situation remained desperate. Over the following weeks, Washington conducted a fighting retreat across New York and New Jersey, with the British in pursuit. The army shrank. Enlistments expired. Men went home. Those who remained were exhausted, demoralized, ill-supplied. By December 1776, the Continental Army had been reduced to perhaps 3,000 men, and many of them would be free to leave when their enlistments expired at the end of the month. The revolution seemed on the verge of collapse, and then Washington did something that changed everything. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led his army across the Delaware River, a river choked with ice through a howling winter storm. The target was a garrison of Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries fighting for the British at Trenton, New Jersey. The plan was for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. In the event, only Washington's force made it across the river. It did not matter. The attack, launched at dawn on December 26, achieved complete surprise. The Hessians, who had been celebrating Christmas and who did not expect an attack in such weather, were overwhelmed. More than 900 were captured. American losses were minimal. It was a small battle by any conventional measure, but its psychological impact was enormous. The revolution, which had seemed doomed, was alive. The army, which had seemed broken, could fight. Washington, whose reputation had suffered during the long retreat across New Jersey, was a hero again. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating a British force and driving the enemy from much of New Jersey. The campaign of 1776–1777 did not win the war, but it may have prevented the war from being lost. The British had expected to crush the rebellion quickly. They had failed. The war would go on. And Washington had demonstrated something essential about his style of command. He was not the most brilliant tactician of the war. He lost more battles than he won, but he understood the nature of the war he was fighting. He did not need to defeat the British army in a decisive battle. He needed to keep his own army in the field to maintain the revolution as a going concern until the British political will to continue the fight was exhausted. It was a strategy of endurance, of survival, of outlasting. It was not glamorous, but it worked. The winter of 1777 to 1778, spent at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, has become legendary, and deservedly so. The army that marched into Valley Forge in December 1777 was in terrible condition. The men were starving. They lacked adequate clothing. Many marched barefoot in the snow. Disease was rampant. Between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers died that winter, most of them from disease, not from combat. And yet, something remarkable happened at Valley Forge. The army was transformed. This transformation was largely the work of a Prussian officer who had come to America to offer his services to the revolution. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, usually known as Baron von Steuben, a title to which his claim was, shall we say, somewhat creative. Von Steuben was not in fact a baron. He had not held the exalted rank in the Prussian army that he claimed. But he was something far more important. He was a brilliant drill master. Von Steuben took the ragged, undisciplined remnants of the Continental Army and trained them. He taught them to march, to maneuver, to fire and reload with speed and precision, to follow orders without hesitation. But he did something more than train soldiers. He respected them. He treated them with dignity. He explained not only what he wanted them to do, but why. The Prussian officer and the American citizen soldiers, from backgrounds so different that they might have been different species, developed a genuine mutual regard. By the spring of 1778, the army that emerged from Valley Forge was a different force. It was still poorly supplied. It was still underpaid when it was paid at all. But it was disciplined. It was confident. It could stand in the line of battle against British regulars and hold its ground. It was an army. 1778 brought another development that would prove decisive: the French alliance. The American victory at Saratoga in 1777, in which an entire British army under General John Burgoyne was forced to surrender, had convinced the French government that the American cause was viable. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity to weaken its ancient rival. In February 1778, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. The French alliance transformed the strategic calculus of the war. The British now faced a global conflict, not merely a colonial rebellion. They had to defend their possessions in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, in India, against a French navy that was among the most powerful in the world. French money, French arms, French troops, and, crucially, French naval power would prove essential to the eventual American victory. The revolution could not have been won without France. This is a truth that Americans sometimes forget, but the French, for their part, did not forget the ideas that the American Revolution had unleashed. Those ideas would, within a decade, transform France itself in ways that even the most radical American revolutionaries could not have anticipated. But that is another story. The final phase of the war shifted to the south. The British strategy, after the defeat at Saratoga and the entry of France into the war, was to focus on the southern colonies where they believed loyalist sentiment was stronger and where the plantation economy offered strategic targets. The southern campaign was brutal, a civil war within a civil war, pitting loyalist against patriot, neighbour against neighbour. The fighting was marked by atrocities on both sides. The British commander, General Charles Cornwallis, won battles but could not pacify the countryside. Then Cornwallis made a fateful decision. In the summer of 1781, he moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay. He expected to be resupplied and reinforced by the Royal Navy. He was not. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting Cornwallis off from the sea. Washington, in a brilliantly executed maneuver, moved his army and a substantial French force under General Rochambeau from New York to Virginia with such speed that Cornwallis did not realize what was happening until it was too late. By late September 1781, Cornwallis was surrounded at Yorktown by American and French forces on land and by the French fleet at sea. The siege lasted 3 weeks. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The major military operations of the Revolutionary War had ended. The Continental Army was disbanded after the war. Its soldiers returned to their farms and workshops, many of them unpaid, their promised pensions uncertain, their sacrifices inadequately recognized. But they had done something extraordinary. They had defeated the most powerful military force on earth. They had held together through defeats that should have broken them, through privations that should have destroyed them, through years of war that seemed at times as though they would never end. They had proven that an army of citizens, free men fighting for their own liberty, could stand against the professional soldiers of an empire. And their commander, George Washington, had proven something equally important, that a general could win a war and then surrender power. That military victory need not lead to military dictatorship. That the revolution was being fought not to replace one form of arbitrary power with another, but to establish something genuinely new. When Washington resigned his commission to the Continental Congress in December 1783, handing back the power that had been entrusted to him, King George III of Britain reportedly said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. He did it, and he was. We have seen how the colonies grew, how they clashed with empires, how they developed their own ideas about liberty and government, how they resisted and then rebelled. Now the story enters its most dramatic phase, the revolution itself, the war, the Declaration, the Constitution, the long, difficult work of transforming a rebellion into a nation. Let us continue. By the middle of the 18th century, British North America had grown into a thriving, diverse, and increasingly self-confident collection of colonies. The 13 colonies stretched from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Their combined population was approximately 2.5 million people, a figure that had been doubling roughly every 25 years, driven by both immigration and natural increase. The colonists were, for the most part, loyal subjects of the British Crown. They spoke English, they followed English law, they participated in English culture. Many of them thought of themselves as English, or at the very least, as British subjects with all the rights and privileges that status implied. But there were tensions, deep, structural tensions that had been building for decades, and that would, in the space of a single generation, transform loyal subjects into revolutionaries. The immediate catalyst for the imperial crisis that led to the American Revolution was, paradoxically, a British victory. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was fought between 1754 and 1763, primarily in North America, between Britain and France and their respective indigenous allies. The war was, at its core, a contest for control of the interior of the continent, particularly the Ohio River Valley, which both Britain and France claimed. Britain won decisively. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave Britain control of all French territory east of the Mississippi River, including Canada. France was effectively eliminated as a colonial power in mainland North America, but victory came at a cost. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government emerged from it with a massive national debt. Someone had to pay. The British government looked at its American colonies, which had been the primary beneficiaries of the war, since the removal of the French threat made the frontier safer for westward expansion, and decided that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. This seemed reasonable to the British. It did not seem reasonable to the colonists. The phrase that would crystallize colonial opposition to British policy was simple, memorable, and devastatingly effective. No taxation without representation. The argument was straightforward. British subjects had the right to be taxed only by legislatures in which they were represented. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. Therefore, Parliament had no right to tax them. The Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other publications, provoked the first major wave of organized colonial resistance. Riots broke out. Stamp distributors were threatened and hanged in effigy. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denying Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The underlying question, did Parliament have the authority to govern the colonies without their consent, was left unresolved. And over the next decade, each successive British attempt to raise revenue from the colonies, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, met with increasingly organised and increasingly radical resistance. Two events in particular accelerated the movement toward revolution. On the 5th of March 1770, a confrontation between British soldiers and a crowd of colonists in Boston escalated into violence. The soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. The incident, quickly dubbed the Boston Massacre by colonial propagandists, became a powerful symbol of British tyranny. The reality was more complicated than the propaganda suggested. The soldiers had been provoked. The crowd had been aggressive. The shooting may have been spontaneous rather than ordered. But the propaganda version, unarmed colonists shot down by British troops in the streets of an American city, was politically devastating. 3 years later, in December of 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous act of vandalism. It was a carefully planned political protest against the Tea Act, which, paradoxically, had actually lowered the price of tea in the colonies, but had done so in a way that reinforced Parliament's claim to the right to tax the colonies without their consent. The British government responded to the Tea Party with a series of punitive measures, the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These closed the port of Boston, restricted colonial self-governance in Massachusetts, and quartered British troops in colonial homes. The Intolerable Acts had the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of isolating Massachusetts and deterring other colonies from resistance, they united the colonies in opposition. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. The revolution was not yet declared, but it was by this point almost inevitable. On the 19th of April, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord, intending to seize colonial weapons stores and arrest rebel leaders. They were met by armed colonists' militia, the citizen soldiers who had been training and organizing for months. At Lexington, a brief confused skirmish left 8 colonists dead. At Concord, the militia fought back more effectively, forcing the British to retreat to Boston along a road lined with colonial sharpshooters. The fighting at Lexington and Concord was not a great battle. It was a skirmish, a confused, small-scale engagement that lasted less than a day. But it was the beginning. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the first shot fired at Concord the shot heard round the world. In the months that followed, fighting spread. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army. The war had begun, in fact, if not yet in formal declaration. In June of 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration of independence from Britain. The committee included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The actual writing fell to the youngest member of the committee, a 33-year-old Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson worked for approximately 17 days. He drew on a lifetime of reading John Locke, Montesquieu, the Scottish Enlightenment, the traditions of English common law. He consulted with Adams and Franklin, who made suggestions and edits. But the language was primarily Jefferson's. What he produced was one of the most important documents in human history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words are so familiar that it is easy to forget how radical they were. All men are created equal. Not all Englishmen, not all Christians, not all property owners, all men. The declaration was adopted by the Continental Congress on the 4th of July, 1776. But even as those words were written, the contradiction at the heart of the American experiment was already present. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote "All men are created equal," owned approximately 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. He freed very few of them. He fathered children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, a relationship that, given the power dynamics involved, cannot meaningfully be described as consensual. Jefferson was not unique in this regard. Many of the founders, Washington, Madison, Patrick Henry, were slaveholders. The society that was declaring its independence in the name of human liberty was simultaneously maintaining one of the most extensive systems of human bondage in the Western world. How do we reconcile this? The honest answer is that we cannot not fully. We can understand the historical context. We can acknowledge that the founders were products of their time. We can recognize that the principles they articulated, however imperfectly they lived up to them, created a framework that others, abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, would use to demand the full realization of those principles. But we cannot explain away the contradiction. It is part of the story. It is, in many ways, the central tension of the entire American story, the gap between the ideal and the reality, between what America says it is and what it has actually been. That gap has never been fully closed. The effort to close it is, arguably, what American history is about. Declaring independence was one thing. Winning it was another. The American colonies had committed themselves to a war against the most powerful military force on Earth. The British Empire commanded the world's largest navy, a professional army with decades of experience, and the financial resources of a global commercial empire. The Americans had enthusiasm, a cause, and very little else. The army that George Washington took command of in July 1775 was not, in any professional sense, an army. It was a collection of militia units from different colonies, each with its own officers, its own customs, its own ideas about discipline and authority. The soldiers were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, men who had volunteered for short terms of service, who expected to go home when their enlistments expired, and who had a profoundly democratic skepticism of military hierarchy. They were brave. Many of them were excellent marksmen. They knew the terrain, but they were not soldiers in the way that the British regulars were soldiers. They lacked training, discipline, equipment, and experience in the coordinated, large-scale maneuvers that European-style warfare demanded. Washington understood this immediately. His primary challenge for the first 2 years of the war was not defeating the British, it was creating an army capable of fighting them. He drilled. He punished desertion. He begged the Continental Congress for supplies, for money, for reinforcements. He wrote letter after letter, meticulous, detailed, often anguished, describing the desperate state of his forces. The army was perpetually short of everything: shoes, blankets, gunpowder, food, pay. The Continental Congress, which had no power to tax and depended on voluntary contributions from the states, could rarely provide what Washington needed, and yet the army held together. Not always, not everywhere. There were desertions, mutinies, and moments when the entire enterprise seemed on the verge of collapse. But somehow, year after year, enough men stayed to keep the cause alive. The first major engagement of the war, the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, actually fought mostly on Breed's Hill outside Boston, was technically a British victory. The British took the hill, but the cost was staggering: over 1,000 British casualties, including a disproportionate number of officers. The Americans, fighting from fortified positions, demonstrated that citizen soldiers could stand against professional troops, but the subsequent campaigns went badly for the Americans. Washington's attempt to defend New York City in the summer of 1776 was a near disaster. The British, under General William Howe, outmaneuvered and outfought the Continental Army in a series of engagements that drove Washington across New Jersey in headlong retreat. By December of 1776, the Revolution appeared to be dying. The army was shrinking. Enlistments were expiring. Morale was collapsing. Thomas Paine, the pamphleteer whose common sense had helped build support for independence, wrote a new series of essays, The American Crisis, that captured the desperation of the moment. "These are the times that try men's souls," Paine wrote. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington read these words to his troops. And then, on the night of December 25, 1776, Christmas night, he led his army across the ice-choked Delaware River and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The attack was a complete success. Over 1,000 Hessians were captured. American casualties were minimal, Trenton was not a strategically decisive battle, but it was a psychologically decisive one. It proved that the Americans could win. It restored morale. It saved the revolution at the moment of its greatest vulnerability. The true turning point of the war came in the autumn of 1777, in upstate New York. A British army under General John Burgoyne was marching south from Canada, intending to link up with forces from New York City and split the rebellious colonies in two. It was a sound strategic concept. Cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies would have been a devastating blow. But Burgoyne's army moved slowly. The terrain was difficult. American forces, a combination of Continental Army regulars and militia, harassed his flanks, disrupted his supply lines, and fought a series of engagements that gradually bled his strength. At the battles of Saratoga, fought in September and October of 1777, Burgoyne's army was surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 6,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. Saratoga was militarily significant, but its greatest impact was diplomatic. France, which had been secretly supplying the Americans with money and weapons for over a year, hoping to weaken its traditional British rival, now saw evidence that the Americans could actually win. In February 1778, France formally allied with the United States, recognizing American independence and committing its military and naval forces to the war. French support transformed the conflict. French money financed the American war effort. French weapons and supplies equipped the Continental Army. French naval power challenged British control of the sea. French military expertise embodied in figures like the Marquis de Lafayette, who served as one of Washington's most trusted officers, enhanced American military capabilities. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was an international conflict. The winter of 1777-1778, spent by Washington's army at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, has become, in American memory, the symbol of revolutionary suffering and perseverance. The conditions were genuinely terrible. The army lacked adequate shelter, clothing, and food. Soldiers went barefoot in the snow. Disease, typhus, typhoid, dysentery killed approximately 2,000 men over the course of the winter. Desertions were frequent, but Valley Forge was also where the Continental Army was transformed. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778, undertook the systematic training of the American army. He taught them to march in formation, to execute battlefield maneuvers, to use the bayonet, to maintain discipline under fire. Von Steuben wrote a training manual, The Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, that became the standard reference for the American military for decades. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was fundamentally different from the army that had entered it. It was still undersupplied, it was still underpaid, but it was now capable of fighting the British on roughly equal terms in open battle. The war dragged on for 3 more years after Valley Forge. Years of indecisive campaigning in the north, brutal partisan warfare in the south, and growing British war weariness. The decisive moment came in the autumn of 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia. A British army under General Charles Cornwallis had established a base at Yorktown, on the York River near the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, learning of Cornwallis's position, saw an opportunity. In coordination with the French, specifically with the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and cut off Cornwallis's escape by sea, Washington marched his army south from New York in a brilliantly executed strategic maneuver. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. French and American forces fighting side by side, their trenches advancing inexorably toward the British lines, gradually tightened the noose. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. As the British army marched out to lay down its arms, the band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether this detail is historically accurate or a later embellishment, it captures the spirit of the moment. The world had, indeed, turned upside down. A collection of colonies, farmers, merchants, lawyers, and citizen soldiers had defeated the British Empire. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The revolution was won. The much harder question, what to do with it, was just beginning. The United States had declared its independence in the name of liberty. Now it had to figure out how to govern itself. This proved to be far more difficult than winning the war. The first attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war and ratified in 1781, was deliberately weak. The founders, having just fought a war against a powerful central authority, were deeply suspicious of creating another one. The Articles gave the national government almost no power. It could not tax. It could not regulate commerce. It could not enforce its own laws. It had no executive branch, no president, no cabinet. It had no judiciary. Each state retained its sovereignty. The national government was essentially a committee of ambassadors from 13 independent nations. It didn't work. The national government could not pay its debts, including the money it owed to the soldiers who had fought the revolution. It could not negotiate effectively with foreign powers. It could not resolve disputes between states. It could not respond to crises. The most alarming crisis came in 1786, when a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays led a rebellion of indebted farmers in western Massachusetts. Shays' rebellion was eventually suppressed by state militia, but the national government's inability to respond to it demonstrated, more clearly than any abstract argument, the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation. Something had to change. In May of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island, characteristically independent, refused to participate, gathered in Philadelphia for what was officially described as a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. They did not amend the Articles, they replaced them. Over the course of a hot Philadelphia summer, the windows of the State House were kept closed to prevent eavesdropping, which made the heat even more oppressive. The delegates debated, argued, compromised, and ultimately produced the Constitution of the United States. The debates were intense. The disagreements were real. The compromises were, in some cases, deeply uncomfortable. The most fundamental disagreement was between large states and small states. Large states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, wanted representation in the national legislature to be based on population. This made sense to them. More people should mean more representation. Small states, New Jersey, Delaware, Connecticut, wanted equal representation for each state, regardless of population. They feared that population minus based representation would allow the large states to dominate the small ones. The solution, known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, created a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives would be based on population, satisfying the large states. It was an elegant solution. It was also, inevitably, imperfect. But it broke the deadlock and allowed the convention to proceed. The most morally troubling compromise of the convention concerned slavery. Southern states wanted enslaved people to be counted for purposes of determining representation in the House of Representatives. This would increase the South's political power, since enslaved people constituted a significant portion of the Southern population. Northern states objected. If enslaved people could not vote, could not hold office, could not participate in the political process in any way if they were, in the eyes of the law, property rather than persons, then counting them for purposes of representation was absurd. The compromise, the 3/5 compromise, counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. The moral implications of this compromise were staggering. It literally encoded into the Constitution the principle that an enslaved human being was less than a full person. It gave slave-holding states disproportionate political power they would use, for the next 7 decades, to protect and expand the institution of slavery. The Constitution also included provisions that protected the slave trade for at least 20 years and required the return of fugitive slaves who escaped to free states. The founders knew what they were doing. Many of them were uncomfortable with it. Some, including Jefferson, who was not present at the convention, expressed the hope that slavery would eventually die out on its own. It did not, and the compromises of 1787 ensured that when the reckoning finally came, it would be catastrophic. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, but only after a fierce national debate between Federalists who supported the new Constitution and Anti-Federalists who feared that it created a national government too powerful and too removed from the people. The Anti-Federalists had a point. The Constitution, as originally written, contained no explicit protections for individual rights. It said what the government could do. It did not say what the government could not do. The compromise that secured ratification was the promise of amendments, a Bill of Rights, that would enumerate specific protections for individual liberty. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were ratified in 1791. They guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial, and other fundamental liberties. The Bill of Rights did not apply to everyone. It did not protect enslaved people. It did not protect women. It did not protect indigenous peoples. Its protections were, in practice, limited to white men, and not always to all of them. But the principles it articulated the idea that government power should be limited, that individuals have rights that no government can legitimately violate, that freedom of expression and freedom of conscience are fundamental. These principles would eventually expand. Slowly, painfully, incompletely, but they would expand. George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States on April 30, 1789, in New York City. He was the obvious choice, the only choice, really. His leadership during the Revolution, his refusal to use his military authority for personal gain, and his genuine commitment to the principles of republican government made him the one figure who could unite the country behind the new Constitution. Washington served 2 terms, and then voluntarily stepped down, establishing, by personal example, the precedent that presidential power was temporary. This decision, perhaps the most important in American political history, demonstrated that the United States would be governed by laws and institutions rather than by the will of a single leader. King George III of England, upon hearing that Washington intended to retire, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He did. Whether he was the greatest man in the world is debatable, but the precedent he set was invaluable. The early republic was immediately divided by a fundamental disagreement about what kind of country America should be. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, a brilliant, ambitious New Yorker who believed in a strong central government, a national bank, a manufacturing economy, and close ties with Britain. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson Washington's Secretary of State, a Virginian who believed in limited government, states' rights, an agricultural economy, and sympathy with revolutionary France. The Hamilton-Jefferson conflict was not merely a personal rivalry, though personal rivalry was certainly part of it. It was a disagreement about the fundamental character of the American nation. Hamilton's vision was urban, commercial, industrial, and centralizing. He wanted America to become a modern economic power with banks, corporations, tariffs, and a government strong enough to manage a complex economy. Jefferson's vision was rural, agricultural, decentralized, and democratic. He distrusted concentrated economic power, feared that cities would create a dependent working class, susceptible to manipulation, and believed that the independent farmer, the yeoman, the man who worked his own land, was the ideal citizen of a republic. Both visions contained truth. Both contained blind spots. Hamilton's vision ignored the democratic dangers of concentrated wealth. Jefferson's vision depended on the continued existence of slavery, the enslaved labor that made the agrarian ideal possible for the planter class. The tension between these two visions, between centralization and decentralization, between commercial ambition and agrarian simplicity, between federal power and states' rights, would run through American politics for the next 2 centuries. It runs through them still. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, the advocate of limited government and strict constitutional interpretation, made a decision that contradicted nearly everything he had ever said about the proper limits of federal power. He bought Louisiana. The Louisiana Purchase negotiated with Napoleon Bonaparte, who needed money for his European wars and who had abandoned his plans for a North American empire after a slave revolt in Haiti destroyed his forces there, doubled the size of the United States overnight. For approximately $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, the United States acquired over 800,000 square miles of territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson had no clear constitutional authority to make the purchase. The Constitution said nothing about acquiring foreign territory. Jefferson knew this. He agonized over it. But the opportunity was too extraordinary to pass up. He bought it anyway. The Louisiana Purchase transformed the United States from a coastal nation into a continental one. It opened the West. It raised, immediately and urgently, the question of whether slavery would be permitted in the new territories, a question that would, within 2 generations, tear the country apart. To explore the new territory, Jefferson commissioned an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Corps of Discovery, as the expedition was called, departed St. Louis in May 1804 and traveled up the Missouri River, across the Rocky Mountains, and down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. They returned in September 1806, having covered approximately 8,000 miles over the course of 2.5 years. The expedition was made possible, in large part, by indigenous peoples who provided guidance, translation, food, and horses at critical moments. The most famous of these was Sacagawea, a young Lemhi Shoshone woman who, along with her infant son, traveled with the expedition from the Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota to the Pacific coast and back. Sacagawea's contributions were practical. She served as interpreter, identified edible plants, and helped negotiate the acquisition of horses from the Shoshone. Her presence, with a baby, also signaled to indigenous groups that the expedition's intentions were not hostile. War parties did not travel with women and children. Lewis and Clark's journals, detailed, observant, and scientifically valuable, documented the geography, natural history, and indigenous cultures of the American West. They reported on landscapes that no European American had ever seen: the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Columbia River Gorge. They also reported that the West was not empty. It was home to hundreds of thousands of indigenous people nations, with their own territories, their own governments, their own histories. The information Lewis and Clark brought back would, within a few decades, be used by the very government that had sent them to dispossess those same peoples. The expedition expanded American knowledge. It also expanded American ambition. And ambition, in the American story, almost always moves in one direction: west. In 1845, a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan wrote a phrase that would become one of the most powerful and most dangerous ideas in American history. He wrote that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The belief that the United States was destined by God, by nature, by the inevitable logic of history to expand across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a seductive idea. It gave a sense of divine purpose to what was, in practical terms, a process of territorial conquest. It transformed aggression into providence. It made the displacement of indigenous peoples seem not merely inevitable but morally right. And it shaped American policy for decades. The expansion of the United States across the continent was accomplished, in large part, at the expense of the indigenous peoples who already lived there. The most infamous episode of this process was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. The act authorized the president to negotiate the removal of Native American nations from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to territory west of the Mississippi River in what is now Oklahoma. The word negotiate is misleading. While some removal treaties were agreed to voluntarily, or at least without direct military coercion, many were imposed by fraud, intimidation, and force. Native leaders who refused to sign were replaced by more compliant individuals. Treaties were negotiated with unauthorized representatives. Communities that refused to leave were removed at gunpoint. The Cherokee, one of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, who had adopted many European American customs, developed a written language, published a newspaper, and established a constitutional government, resisted removal through the legal system. Their case reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in their favor. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, with rights that the state of Georgia was bound to respect. President Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether Jackson actually said these words is debated, but the sentiment was real. The federal government refused to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. The Cherokee were forced to march. The removal of the Cherokee in 1838, known as the Trail of Tears, covered approximately 1,000 miles. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died during the march from cold, disease, exhaustion, and starvation. They were guarded by federal troops. They were not permitted to stop. The Trail of Tears was not an isolated incident. It was the most visible example of a systematic policy of displacement that affected dozens of indigenous nations across the eastern United States. The land that was cleared by removal was, in many cases, immediately occupied by white settlers and by the enslaved people who worked their cotton fields. Indian removal and the expansion of slavery were not separate processes. They were the same process. The cotton economy that drove southern expansion required land. Indian removal provided it. The other major territorial acquisition of this period came through war. In 1846, the United States provoked a conflict with Mexico, a conflict that many Americans, including a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, recognized as a war of aggression. The immediate cause was the annexation of Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico in 1836 and had been admitted to the Union in 1845. Mexico had never recognized Texan independence. The United States and Mexico also disputed the boundary between Texas and Mexico. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande. Mexico claimed the Nueces River further north. President James K. Polk a committed expansionist, sent American troops to the disputed territory. When Mexican forces engaged them, Polk told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil and asked for a declaration of war. The war lasted 2 years. American forces invaded Mexico from multiple directions, ultimately capturing Mexico City itself. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, forced Mexico to cede approximately half of its territory to the United States, including all of present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The Mexican Cession, combined with the earlier annexation of Texas and the Oregon Territory agreement with Britain, gave the United States its continental shape, a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Manifest destiny had been achieved. The cost, in Mexican lives, in Native American lives, in the moral compromises required to justify conquest as providence, was enormous, and the question that had been deferred at every step, the question of slavery in the new territories, could no longer be avoided. In January 1848, 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, a carpenter named James Marshall found gold in the American River at Sutter's Mill in California. The discovery triggered the largest mass migration in American history to that point. By 1849, approximately 80,000 people had arrived in California from across the United States and around the world. The 49s, the gold rush transformed California from a remote, sparsely populated territory into a booming, chaotic, multicultural society almost overnight. It brought Americans, Mexicans, Chinese, Europeans, South Americans and others into a volatile mix of competition, cooperation, and conflict. It also accelerated the dispossession and destruction of California's indigenous peoples who were subjected to violence, displacement, and forced labor that amounted, in the judgment of many historians, to genocide. California was admitted to the Union as a free state in 1850, part of a complex, legislative package known as the Compromise of 1850, which attempted, one last time, to paper over the fundamental conflict between the slave states and the free states. The compromise held for barely a decade. In 1858, a former one-term congressman from Illinois, a tall, angular, self-educated lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, accepted the Republican nomination for the United States Senate with a speech that contained one of the most famous passages in American political rhetoric. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln said, quoting the Bible. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." Lincoln lost the Senate race, but the speech and the debates with his opponent, Stephen Douglas, that followed, made him a national figure. 2 years later, he was elected president, and the House divided began to fall. By the 1850s, the question of slavery had become the defining issue in American political life. It was not a new question. It had been present at the founding. It had been deferred by the constitutional compromises of 1787. It had been temporarily managed by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew a line across the Louisiana Territory. Slavery permitted south of the line, prohibited north of it, but each new territorial acquisition reopened the question. Each new state admitted to. The Union forced a decision, slave or free. Each decision altered the balance of power in Congress and in the Electoral College. The political system was designed for compromise, but slavery was a question that ultimately could not be compromised. The Compromise of 1850 included a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act that required citizens of free states to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped from slavery. The law was deeply unpopular in the North. It forced ordinary people who had previously been able to ignore slavery as a distant Southern institution, to become active participants in its enforcement. It radicalized the North more effectively than any abolitionist speech could have. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, partly in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, sold 300,000 copies in its first year and became the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It depicted the cruelty of slavery in terms that made millions of Northerners feel the moral urgency of the issue for the first time. When Abraham Lincoln met Stowe during the Civil War, he reportedly said, So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. Whether the anecdote is precisely true, it captures a real truth about the power of storytelling to change hearts, and, eventually, to change history. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pushed through Congress by Stephen Douglas, effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing the settlers of new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. The result was chaos. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the territory, each side trying to establish a majority. Violence broke out. Pro-slavery raiders sacked the town of Lawrence. The abolitionist John Brown, a fierce, possibly unhinged zealot who believed he was called by God to destroy slavery, led a retaliatory attack at Pottawatomie Creek, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. Bleeding Kansas became a preview of the larger war to come. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued a decision in the case of Dred Scott v. Sandford that inflamed the conflict further. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Dred Scott decision was intended to settle the slavery question once and for all. It had the opposite effect. It convinced millions of Northerners that the slaveholding interest had captured the federal government and was using it to expand slavery across the entire nation. In October 1859, John Brown, the same man who had killed pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, led a small band of followers in an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was audacious and, in practical terms, insane. He intended to seize the arsenal's weapons, arm enslaved people in the surrounding area, and trigger a general slave uprising that would spread across the South. The raid failed. Brown's small force was quickly surrounded by local militia and then by United States Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown was captured, tried, convicted of treason, and hanged, but his execution made him a martyr in the North. His trial and his dignified conduct. During it, he refused to recant. He spoke eloquently about the injustice of slavery. He accepted death with composure, transformed him from a violent extremist into a symbol of moral courage. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. The South looked at the North's response to John Brown, the sympathy, the fanatism, and saw confirmation of its worst fears. The North, in Southern eyes, was not merely opposed to the expansion of slavery, it was actively seeking to destroy it, and to destroy the social order that depended on it. The bonds that held the Union together were fraying to the breaking point. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. He won without carrying a single Southern state. In most Southern states, he was not, even on the ballot. His election was, for the South, the final straw. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. Lincoln had not yet taken office. He would not be inaugurated until March 4, 1861. The Union was dissolving, and Lincoln, the rail splitter from Illinois, the self-taught lawyer, the man who had lost more elections than he had won, was about to inherit the worst crisis in American history. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. No one was killed in the fighting, a fact that seems almost absurd in light of what followed. The Civil War had begun. Over the next 4 years, it would kill approximately 750,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined, before or since. It would devastate the South. It would end slavery. It would transform the meaning of the United States. And it would produce suffering on a scale that no one in 1861 could have imagined. What were they fighting for? This question has been debated for over a century and a half. It should not be. The Confederacy seceded to protect slavery. This is not a matter of interpretation. The secession declarations of the Confederate States say so explicitly. Mississippi's declaration states, "Our position is thoroughly, identified with the institution of slavery the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration lists the defense of slavery as the primary cause of secession. South Carolina's declaration cites northern interference with slavery as its central grievance. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, delivered a speech in March 1861 in which he declared that the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. The leaders of the Confederacy were clear about their motivations. The subsequent attempt to reframe the war as a conflict about states' rights or northern aggression, an effort that began almost immediately after the war ended and continues to this day, is a distortion of the historical record. The Union fought, initially, to preserve the Union. Lincoln made this clear repeatedly in the early months of the war. He was not, at the outset, fighting to end slavery. He was fighting to prevent the dissolution of the United States. But as the war progressed, as the scale of the conflict grew, as the casualties mounted, as the inadequacy of fighting a war to preserve a union that included slavery became increasingly apparent, the war's purpose evolved. By 1862, Lincoln had concluded that the war could not be won, and the peace could not be sustained, without ending slavery. The Civil War was the first modern war. It was the first major conflict in which railroads played a decisive logistical role. The first, in which telegraph communications allowed commanders to coordinate operations across vast distances. The first in which industrialized manufacturing, factories, producing weapons, ammunition, uniforms and equipment on an unprecedented scale, determined the outcome as much as battlefield courage. It was also the first war in which the devastating combination of improved weapons and traditional tactics produced casualties on an industrial scale. The rifled musket, standard issue for both sides by the middle of the war, was accurate at ranges 3 or 4 times greater than the smoothbore muskets of earlier conflicts. But infantry tactics had not yet adapted to this change. Soldiers, still advanced, in dense formations, shoulder to shoulder, across open ground, formations designed for an era when the enemy could not hit you until you were within 50 yards. Now, the enemy could hit you at 300 yards. The result was slaughter. At the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, approximately 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. It remains the bloodiest day in American history. At Gettysburg, July 1st, Massads 3, 1863, total casualties exceeded 50,000 over 3 days. Pickett's charge, the Confederate assault on the Union Center on the third day, sent approximately 12,500 men across nearly a mile of open ground under concentrated artillery and rifle fire. Roughly half of them became casualties. The men who fought the Civil War were for the most part not professional soldiers. They were volunteers, farmers, clerks, teachers, mechanics, who had enlisted for reasons ranging from patriotism to peer pressure to the adventure of seeing the world beyond their hometown. They learnt to kill. They learnt to endure. They learnt to watch their friends die. They wrote letters home that are, even now, almost unbearable to read. Letters full of homesickness, fear, determination, and a kind of bewildered courage that defies easy characterization. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all persons held as slaves in the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free. The proclamation did not free all enslaved people. It applied only to the Confederate states, states over which the federal government had, at that moment, no actual control. It did not apply to the border states, slave states that had remained in the Union, where Lincoln feared that emancipation would push them into the Confederacy. It was, in practical terms, a war measure, an executive order justified by the president's authority as commander-in-chief. It was designed to weaken the Confederacy by undermining its labor force, and to strengthen the Union by allowing African Americans to serve in the military. But its symbolic power was enormous. The war was now, officially and irrevocably, a war against slavery. The Union cause was no longer merely the preservation of a political arrangement, it was the liberation of 4 million human beings. African American soldiers, approximately 180,000 of them, served in the Union Army during the war. They fought with distinction at Fort Wagner, at the Battle of the Crater, at dozens of other engagements. They served knowing that capture by the Confederacy meant not imprisonment, but enslavement or execution. They fought anyway. By 1864, the Union had found the commanders who would win the war. Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, unprepossessing man from Ohio, who had failed at almost everything he had attempted before the war, proved to be the most effective Union general. He understood something that his predecessors had not, that the Union's advantage lay not in brilliant maneuvers, but in relentless pressure. The Union had more men, more resources, more industrial capacity, if it used those advantages consistently. If it fought, and kept fighting, and never stopped fighting, the Confederacy would eventually be ground down. It was not an elegant strategy, it was a brutal one. Grant's campaigns in 1864 and 1865 produced casualties that horrified the Northern public. At the Battle of the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, engagement after engagement, the losses mounted, but Grant did not retreat. After each battle, instead of pulling back to regroup, as previous Union commanders had done, he moved forward, sideways, around, always pressing, always advancing. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he wrote. It took longer than a summer, but the logic was sound. Meanwhile, in the West, William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's most trusted subordinate, was executing a strategy of a different kind. Sherman marched his army from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Atlanta, Georgia, capturing the city in September 1864, just in time to boost Lincoln's re-election campaign. He then marched from Atlanta to the sea, the famous March to the Sea, destroying everything of military value in a 60-mile-wide swath across Georgia. Sherman's march was deliberate devastation. He targeted not the Confederate army, but the Confederate economy, the railroads, the factories, the farms, the infrastructure that sustained the war effort. He wanted to demonstrate that the Confederacy could not protect its own people. He wanted to break the South's will to fight. It was brutal, it was effective, and it raised questions about the morality of total war that are still debated today. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, commanding what remained of the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the village of Appomattox Court House in Virginia. The meeting between the two generals was brief and dignified. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers were to be paroled, not imprisoned. Officers could keep their sidearms. Soldiers who owned horses or mules could keep them. They would need them for the spring planting, Grant explained. Lee accepted the terms. The war, effectively, was over. Over the following weeks, the remaining Confederate forces surrendered. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was captured in Georgia in May. The Union was preserved, slavery was destroyed, 4 million people were free. The cost was almost incomprehensible. 750,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more, wounded, many of them maimed for life. The South was economically devastated. Its cities burned, its railroads destroyed, its labor system abolished, its wealth evaporated. And on April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the following morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at Lincoln's bedside, reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Lincoln's assassination, at the moment of victory, at the threshold of peace, was the final cruelty of the Civil War. The man who had guided the nation through its greatest crisis, who had grown from a cautious politician into a moral leader of extraordinary depth, who had written and spoken with a clarity and compassion that still resonate across the centuries, that man was gone. The task of rebuilding the nation, of integrating 4 million formerly enslaved people into American society, of reconstructing the South, of healing the wounds of war, fell to lesser men, and they were not equal to it. The period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, lasted from 1865 to 1877. It was, in many ways, the most important and most tragic chapter in American history. The question was simple to state and almost impossible to answer. What would freedom mean for 4 million formerly enslaved people? The initial years of Reconstruction offered extraordinary promise. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race. For a brief, remarkable period, African Americans in the South voted, held office, attended public schools, and participated in the political process. Black men served in state legislatures, in the United States Congress, and in positions of local authority across the former Confederacy. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first African American senator in 1870. Between 1870 and 1877, 16 African Americans served in Congress. It was an extraordinary experiment in multiracial democracy, the most ambitious attempt to create a genuinely equal society that the Western world had ever seen. It was destroyed. The destruction of Reconstruction was accomplished through a combination of terrorism, political manipulation, and the eventual abandonment of black citizens by the federal government. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Tennessee in 1866 by former Confederate soldiers, used systematic violence to terrorize black voters and their white allies. Klan members burned homes, whipped and murdered black citizens, attacked Republican office holders, and used threats and intimidation to suppress black political participation. The violence was not random. It was organized, strategic, and devastatingly effective. The federal government, under President Grant, made genuine efforts to suppress the Klan. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 gave the president authority to use military force against terrorist organizations, and federal prosecutions did significant damage to Klan operations in some areas. But the political will to sustain this effort waned. Northern voters, tired of the ongoing costs of Reconstruction, increasingly indifferent to the fate of black Southerners, and distracted by economic problems, particularly the severe depression that began in 1873, gradually lost interest. In 1877, a disputed presidential election was resolved by an informal agreement, the Compromise of 1877, in which the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was awarded the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. The troops left, and without federal protection, the gains of Reconstruction were systematically dismantled. Over the following decades, Southern states enacted a comprehensive system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement known as Jim Crow. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other mechanisms were used to prevent black citizens from voting. Segregation laws mandated the separation of the races in schools, public facilities, transportation, and virtually every aspect of public life. The Supreme Court, in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, upheld segregation as constitutional, establishing the doctrine of separate but equal that would stand for nearly 60 years. Separate was real. Equal was a fiction. The promises of Reconstruction, citizenship, equality, political participation were betrayed. The country that had fought a war to end slavery allowed a new system of racial oppression to take its place. The consequences would last for a century. In the decades following the Civil War, the United States underwent an economic transformation so rapid and so comprehensive that it changed not only the country, but the world. The term Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain, captured the contradiction. The surface was gold. Beneath it, the reality was darker. Between 1870 and 1900, the United States was transformed from an agricultural nation into the world's largest industrial economy. The numbers are staggering. Railroad mileage increased from approximately 35,000 miles in 1865 to over 250,000 miles by 1900, the largest railroad network in the world. Steel production exploded. Oil production, virtually non-existent before the Civil War, made the United States the world's leading producer by the 1880s. Manufacturing output surpassed that of Britain, France, and Germany combined. The men who built this industrial empire became the wealthiest individuals in American history, and some of the wealthiest in world history. John the 500th. Rockefeller controlled approximately 90% of American oil refining through his Standard Oil Company. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry. J.P. Morgan controlled vast segments of American banking and finance. Cornelius Vanderbilt built a railroad empire. They were called captains of industry by their admirers and robber barons by their critics. Both labels contained truth. These men were genuinely innovative. They created industries, employed millions of people, built infrastructure that transformed the physical landscape of the country, and funded universities, libraries, and charitable institutions on an unprecedented scale. They also exploited workers, crushed competition, corrupted politicians, and accumulated wealth in quantities that would have astonished the kings of Europe. The industrial economy's insatiable demand for labor was met by the largest wave of immigration in American history. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 23 million immigrants arrived in the United States, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews, Greeks, Hungarians, Czechs, and others poured through Ellis Island and into the factories, mines, and sweatshops of industrial America. They came for the same reason immigrants have always come to America: opportunity. The promise that hard work could produce a better life, if not for themselves, then for their children. The reality was often harsh. Immigrants worked long hours for low wages in dangerous conditions. They lived in overcrowded tenements. They faced discrimination, exploitation, and nativist hostility from Americans who resented their presence and feared their differences. But they came, and they stayed, and they built lives, communities, and eventually political power that would reshape the country. The American identity, always a work in progress, always absorbing new elements, was permanently enlarged by this great wave of immigration. The foods, the languages, the religions, the cultural traditions that these immigrants brought with them became part of what America is. The conditions of industrial labor, the long hours, the low wages, the dangerous working environments, the lack of any social safety net, produced a labor movement that, at its height, represented one of the most significant challenges to the American economic order. Workers organized. They formed unions, the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, the Industrial Workers of the World. They struck, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. They demanded better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions, and the right to organize collectively. The response was often violent. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, the Homestead Strike in 1892, the Pullman Strike in 1894. Each of these confrontations involved violence, often initiated by employers or by state and federal authorities acting on their behalf. The struggle between labor and capital, between the people who did the work and the people who owned the factories, would define American politics for the next century. For most of its history, the United States had been focused inward, on westward, expansion, on internal development, on the great domestic crisis of slavery and civil war. By the end of the 19th century, that began to change. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, ostensibly over Spanish treatment of Cuban rebels, practically over the expansion of American influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The war lasted barely 4 months. Spain, a declining imperial power, was no match for the emerging industrial giant across the Atlantic. The result was transformative. Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. America had, almost overnight, become an imperial power, with overseas territories, military bases, and the responsibilities that came with governing millions of people who had not asked to be governed. The acquisition of the Philippines was particularly controversial. Filipino independence, fighters who had been fighting against Spanish colonial rule, now found themselves fighting against American colonial rule. The Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902, with guerrilla resistance continuing for years afterward, killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Filipino civilians and several thousand American soldiers. The war raised fundamental questions about American identity. Was the United States a republic or an empire? Could a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal justify governing other peoples without their consent? These questions were debated fiercely. They were never fully resolved. In April 1917, the United States entered the First World War, the catastrophic European conflict that had been raging since 1914. American entry was driven by a combination of factors: the sinking of American ships by German submarines, the Zimmermann telegram in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico, and a growing sense among American leaders that the outcome of the war would affect American security and economic interests. The arrival of American forces, eventually numbering over 2 million soldiers, helped tip the balance against Germany and its allies. The war ended in November 1918. The cost to the United States was significant. Over 116,000 American soldiers killed, but small compared to the catastrophic losses suffered by the European powers, who had been fighting for 4 years. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire each lost millions. President Woodrow Wilson hoped that American participation in the war would give the United States the moral authority to shape the peace. His 14 points, a vision for a post-war order based on self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations that would prevent future wars, represented an ambitious attempt to remake the international system. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, incorporated some of Wilson's ideas but rejected others. The League of Nations was established, but the United States Senate refused to ratify American membership, a decision that Wilson regarded as a catastrophic failure and that many historians believe weakened the League fatally. The United States retreated into isolationism, a determination to stay out of European affairs that would last until the next Great War forced the country back onto the world stage. The 1920s were a decade of extraordinary cultural energy and profound social change. The economy boomed. Mass production, pioneered by Henry Ford's assembly line, made consumer goods affordable for millions of Americans for the first time. Automobiles, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, the material comforts of modern life spread rapidly through the American middle class. Jazz, born in the African-American communities of New Orleans and carried north during the Great Migration, became the defining music of the decade. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and others created an art form of extraordinary sophistication and emotional power that crossed racial boundaries, even in a deeply segregated society. Women won the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the culmination of a struggle that had lasted over 70 years. The new woman of the 1920s, symbolized by the flapper, with her short hair, short skirts, and refusal to conform to Victorian standards of behavior, represented a visible assertion of female independence and autonomy. The Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African-American literature, art, music, and intellectual life centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, produced writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, artists like Aaron Douglas, and thinkers like Webb, Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. Prohibition, the constitutional ban on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, enacted in 1920, was simultaneously one of the most ambitious and one of the most catastrophic social experiments in American history. It reduced alcohol consumption, but also created a vast illegal economy dominated by organized crime. It was repealed in 1933. The prosperity of the 1920s ended with devastating suddenness. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. In the weeks that followed, billions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. The Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history, lasted for over a decade. At its lowest point, unemployment reached approximately 25%. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. The human suffering was immense. Families lost everything. Homeless camps, called Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the crisis, sprang up in cities across the country. Dust storms devastated the agricultural heartland, creating the Dust Bowl and driving hundreds of thousands of farm families from their land. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide. His promise of a New Deal for the American people inaugurated the most significant transformation of the relationship between the federal government and the American people since the Civil War. Roosevelt's New Deal created Social Security, providing a safety net for the elderly. It established the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the financial markets. It created agencies that built roads, bridges, dams, schools, and other infrastructure across the country. It established the right of workers to organize unions and bargain collectively. The New Deal did not end the Depression, that would require the massive military spending of World War II, but it fundamentally changed the role of the federal government in American life. Before the New Deal, most Americans had minimal direct contact with the federal government. After the New Deal, the government was an active presence, regulating the economy, providing social insurance, investing in infrastructure. Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms, serving as president from 1933 until his death in April 1945. His presidency redefined the office and reshaped American politics in ways that are still felt today. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack killed 2,403 Americans, sank or damaged 8 battleships, and destroyed nearly 200 aircraft. The following day, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. He described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. The United States entered the Second World War. America's contribution to the Allied victory was, above all, industrial. The United States mobilized its economy for war, with a speed and scale that astonished the world. Automobile factories converted to producing tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Shipyards that had been idle during the Depression worked around the clock. Women, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers. The numbers tell the story. During the war, the United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.7 million machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It built a navy that was larger than all other navies in the world combined. This industrial output was the decisive factor in the Allied victory. The Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, could not match it. They were overwhelmed not merely by superior fighting but by superior production. American forces entered combat in North Africa in late 1942, moved into Sicily and Italy in 1943, and invaded France on June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The landings at Normandy, on beaches named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. At Omaha Beach alone, American casualties on the first day exceeded 2,000. When American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River in April 1945, Germany was defeated. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in the Pacific was, in many ways, even more brutal than the war in Europe. The distances were enormous. Thousands of miles of ocean separating the scattered islands that served as stepping stones toward Japan. The fighting was savage. Japanese forces fought with a tenacity and willingness to die that shocked American soldiers and Marines. Surrender was considered dishonorable in the Japanese military code, and Japanese soldiers frequently fought to the death. The island-hopping campaign, from Guadalcanal in 1942 through Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, produced some of the most intense combat of the entire war. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Marines were killed in 5 weeks of fighting on an island barely 8 square miles in area. At Okinawa, total casualties, American, Japanese, and civilian, exceeded 200,000. In August 1945, the United States used a new weapon, a weapon that would change the nature of warfare and the course of human history. On August 6th, an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed approximately 70 to 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the following weeks and months from burns and radiation. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, VJ Day. The Second World War was over. The decision to use the atomic bomb has been debated ever since. President Truman argued that it saved hundreds of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, that would have been lost in an invasion of the Japanese homeland. Critics argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the bombs were unnecessary, that they constituted a war crime. The debate continues. What is not debatable is that the atomic bombings ushered in a new era, the nuclear age, in which humanity possessed, for the first time, the capacity to destroy itself. The liberation of Europe revealed a horror that transcended anything the war itself had produced. The Nazi regime had systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, homosexuals, and others, in a genocide now known as the Holocaust. American soldiers who liberated the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others, encountered scenes of suffering that were beyond anything their experience or imagination had prepared them for. Skeletal survivors, mass graves, the industrial machinery of death. General Dwight the 500th Eisenhower, who would later become president, insisted that the camps be documented and that as many people as possible be brought to see them. He wanted the evidence to be preserved so that no one could ever deny what had happened. The Holocaust redefined the moral landscape of the 20th century. It demonstrated, with terrible clarity, what human beings were capable of doing to each other when ideology, technology, and state power were combined in the service of hatred. It also contributed to the creation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, attempts to establish international norms that would prevent such atrocities from happening again. Whether those attempts have succeeded is a question that each generation must answer for itself. The world that emerged from the Second World War was dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had been allies during the war, united by the common enemy of Nazi Germany, but their alliance was one of convenience rather than conviction. The United States was a capitalist democracy. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. Their visions of the future were fundamentally incompatible. The Cold War, the global rivalry between these two superpowers, lasted from approximately 1947 to 1991. It shaped every aspect of American life and American foreign policy for nearly half a century. The central strategy of American Cold War policy was containment. The idea that Soviet expansion should be resisted wherever it occurred, that communism should be prevented from spreading beyond the territories it already controlled. This strategy produced a global network of American military bases, alliances, and commitments. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949 to defend Western Europe against Soviet aggression. American troops were stationed in Germany, Japan, South Korea, and dozens of other countries. Containment also produced two major wars. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, ended in a stalemate that left Korea divided along roughly the same line where the fighting had begun. Over 36,000 Americans died. The Vietnam War, the longest and most controversial military conflict in American history, lasted, in its American phase, from 1965 to 1973. Over 58,000 Americans died. Vietnamese casualties, military and civilian, on both sides, numbered in the millions. Vietnam divided American society more deeply than any event since the Civil War. Anti-war protests, draft resistance, and a profound loss of trust in government authority marked the late 1960s and early 1970s. The war ended in 1975, with the fall of Saigon, a defeat that haunted American foreign policy for decades. Hanging over the entire Cold War, over every crisis, every confrontation, every diplomatic exchange, was the shadow of nuclear weapons. By the early 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, and, for that matter, the rest of the world, many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, in its grimly appropriate acronym, held that neither side would launch a nuclear attack because the retaliation would be equally devastating. The closest the world came to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the American coast. For 13 days, the two superpowers stood at the brink of a conflict that could have ended civilization. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, through a combination of back-channel communication, careful diplomacy, and sheer luck, managed to defuse the crisis. The Soviets withdrew their missiles, The Americans secretly agreed to remove their own missiles from Turkey. The world survived, but the experience left a permanent mark on the American psyche. The knowledge that annihilation was not merely possible, but, on at least one occasion, had come terrifyingly close. If the American Revolution was the first attempt to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, the Civil Rights Movement was the second, and in many ways, it was the more difficult one. By the mid-20th century, the United States was the most powerful nation on earth. It had defeated fascism. It was leading the free world against communism. It proclaimed itself the champion of democracy and human rights. And yet, within its own borders, millions of its citizens, African Americans, were denied the most basic rights of citizenship. In the South, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in every aspect of public life: schools, buses, restaurants, water fountains, restrooms. Black citizens were systematically excluded from the political process through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. In the North, discrimination was less explicit but equally pervasive. Black Americans were confined to segregated neighborhoods by restrictive housing covenants and discriminatory lending practices. They were excluded from many jobs. They attended underfunded schools. The contradiction between America's stated ideals and its actual practices was, by the 1950s, becoming impossible to ignore. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama, to a white passenger. She was arrested. Her arrest triggered the Montgomery bus boycott, a 13-month protest during which the black community of Montgomery refused to ride the city buses. The boycott was organized by local activists and led by a young Baptist minister who had recently arrived in Montgomery. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. King was 26 years old. He was eloquent, charismatic, deeply educated in theology and philosophy, and committed to the principle of nonviolent resistance that he had studied in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. But the boycott was only the beginning. Over the next decade, the civil rights movement, through sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, voter registration drives, and countless acts of individual courage, challenged and eventually dismantled the legal structure of segregation in the American South. The sit-in movement began in February 1960, when 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter and refused to leave. Within weeks, sit-ins had spread to dozens of cities across the South. The Freedom Rides of 1961 tested the enforcement of Supreme Court decisions banning segregation in interstate bus terminals. Integrated groups of riders were met with extreme violence in Alabama. Buses were firebombed, riders were beaten. The images, broadcast on national television, shocked the nation. In 1963, King led a campaign of nonviolent protest in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in the South. The campaign was met by Police Commissioner Bull Connor with fire hoses, attack dogs, and mass arrests. The images of children being blasted by fire hoses and attacked by police dogs were broadcast around the world. King was arrested during the Birmingham campaign. From his jail cell, he wrote one of the most important documents in American history, the Letter from Birmingham Jail, a passionate, intellectually rigorous defense of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," he wrote. On August 28, 1963, approximately 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was there that King delivered the speech that would define the movement and that would become one of the most celebrated pieces of oratory in human history. "I have a dream," he said, "that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." The speech was broadcast live on national television. It moved millions. The legislative victories of the civil rights movement transformed American law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, education, and public accommodations. It was the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed after the brutal suppression of a voting rights march in Selma, Alabama, where peaceful marchers were attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on a day known as Bloody Sunday, prohibited the discriminatory practices that had been used to prevent black citizens from voting. These laws did not end racism. They did not create the just society that King had envisioned. The struggle for racial equality in America is ongoing, as events in the decades since have repeatedly demonstrated. But they changed the legal framework. They established, as a matter of law, that racial discrimination was incompatible with American democracy, and they were achieved, overwhelmingly, through the courage of ordinary people. People who sat at lunch counters, knowing they would be attacked. People who rode buses, knowing they would be beaten. People who marched, knowing they might be killed. People who believed that the gap between what America was and what it said it was could be closed. That belief is, arguably, the most American thing of all. The late 20th century in America was a period of extraordinary change, cultural, technological, political, and social. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of upheaval. The Vietnam War divided the nation. The anti-war movement mobilized millions, particularly young people, and fundamentally challenged the assumption that American military power was always used in the service of just causes. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963, shocked the nation. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 deepened the sense of national crisis. The women's movement, the second wave of feminism, challenged gender discrimination in employment, education, and the law. The publication of Betty, Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, articulated the dissatisfaction of millions of American women with the constraints of traditional gender roles. The environmental movement, galvanized by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which documented the devastating effects of pesticide use, led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the passage of landmark environmental legislation. The Watergate scandal, the revelation that President Richard Nixon had authorized illegal surveillance of his political opponents and had attempted to cover up the crime, led to Nixon's resignation in August 1974. It was the most serious constitutional crisis since the Civil War, and it permanently damaged public trust in government. The Cold War ended, not with a nuclear exchange, but with an implosion. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union, weakened by economic stagnation, political corruption, and the costs of maintaining a global empire, began to reform under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were intended to save the Soviet system. They destroyed it. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for 4 decades. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War was over. The United States was the sole superpower, the most powerful nation in the history of the world, without a serious rival. The question of what to do with that power, how to use it, how to restrain it, how to reconcile it with the democratic principles on which the nation was founded, would define the decades that followed. The late 20th century also saw the beginning of a technological transformation as profound as the Industrial Revolution. The personal computer, introduced commercially in the late 1970s and early 1980s, transformed the way Americans worked, communicated, and organized information. The Internet, originally a military communications network, became publicly available in the early 1990s and, within a decade, had reshaped virtually every aspect of American life. Silicon Valley, a stretch of Northern California that became the center of the American technology industry, produced companies and products that changed the world. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook. These companies, founded by Americans, built on American technology, and funded by American capital, created a digital infrastructure that connected billions of people across the globe. The information revolution brought extraordinary benefits: access to knowledge, new forms of communication, economic growth, medical advances. It also brought disruption, job displacement, privacy erosion, the spread of misinformation, and new forms of social isolation. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers, affiliated with the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, seized 4 commercial aircraft. 2 planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A third struck the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth, its passengers having learned of the other attacks and having attempted to retake the aircraft, crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. September 11th was the deadliest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Its impact, psychological, political, and military, was immense. The United States launched the War on Terror, a broad and open-ended campaign against terrorist organizations and the states that supported them. The invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 toppled the Taliban regime that had harbored al-Qaeda. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003, justified by claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved to be unfounded, removed Saddam Hussein, but produced a prolonged, costly occupation and a sectarian conflict that destabilized the entire region. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq lasted for nearly 2 decades, cost trillions of dollars, and killed hundreds of thousands of people, including over 7,000 American soldiers. The debate about these wars, their justification, their conduct, their consequences continues. The early decades of the 21st century brought a series of challenges that tested American institutions and American identity. The Great Recession of 2008, triggered by the collapse of the housing market and the failure of major financial institutions, was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and their savings. The election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first African-American president of the United States, was a historic moment. It demonstrated that the country's highest office was no longer restricted by race. It also provoked a backlash that exposed the persistence of racial prejudice in American society. The COVID-19 pandemic, which reached the United States in early 2020, killed over 1 million Americans and disrupted every aspect of national life. It exposed deep inequalities in the American healthcare system and deepened political divisions that were already severe. The question of immigration, the crisis of climate change, the erosion of democratic norms, the polarization of political discourse, the persistence of racial inequality, the power of technology companies, the future of American democracy itself. These are the challenges that confront the United States as it moves deeper into the 21st century. And so we arrive at the end, or rather, at the present moment, which is not an end at all. It is a pause, a place where the story continues, even as we stop to look back at the road that brought us here. What is America? The question sounds simple. It is not. America is a place, a vast, beautiful, varied landscape stretching from sea to sea. But it is also an idea, a proposition, as Lincoln called it, that all men are created equal. A proposition that has never been fully realized and has never been entirely abandoned. America is a history of extraordinary achievement, of democratic self-governance, of scientific and technological innovation, of cultural creativity that has shaped the world. It is also a history of extraordinary injustice, of slavery, of genocide, of exclusion, of the gap between what the country promises and what it delivers. America is a contradiction. It has always been a contradiction. The same nation that wrote "all men are created equal" enslaved millions. The same nation that fought a war to end slavery allowed a new system of racial oppression to take its place. The same nation that welcomed millions of immigrants also excluded and discriminated against them. But contradictions are not necessarily fatal. They are, in some sense, the engine of progress. The gap between the ideal and the reality creates a tension, a restlessness that drives change. The people who have done the most to improve America, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor organizers, the civil rights leaders, have done so by holding the country to its own stated principles. They have said, in effect, "You promised, now deliver." That demand, the demand that America become what it says it is the central thread of the American story. It runs from the Declaration of Independence through the abolition of slavery, through women's suffrage, through the New Deal, through the civil rights movement, through every struggle for justice and inclusion that has marked the nation's history. It is not finished. It may never be finished. The work of building a more perfect union is, by definition, ongoing, but the work continues, and that, perhaps, is what matters most. Before I let you rest, I want to leave you with one last thought. America is not a finished product. It is a process, a conversation, an argument that has been going on for nearly 250 years and shows no signs of ending. The voices in that argument have changed over time. They have grown more numerous, more diverse, more insistent. Voices that were once excluded. The voices of women, of Black Americans, of immigrants, of indigenous peoples, of workers, of all those who were told that the promise of America was not meant for them. Those voices are louder now than they have ever been. They are asking the same question that every generation of Americans has asked, in one form or another. What does it mean to be free? The answer is never settled. It is always being negotiated. And that negotiations, difficult, contentious, sometimes painful, is the living heart of the American experiment. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are, whether it's late at night in New York, or the early hours in London, or a quiet morning in Seoul. Thank you for sharing this journey. Tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and what city are you listening from? I love knowing that this story, the American story, which belongs to all of us, in one way or another, is being heard, right now, all over the world. Good night, and sweet dreams. The story continues tomorrow.